Okay, we can begin. I'll start with some of the housekeeping items that we always start with our session. First off, welcome back from lunch. And for those just joining us, we're going to begin this afternoon session on the topic of emerging issues. But first, there'll be polls that two questions that pop up during each session to comply with, in our case, the Pennsylvania CE requirements. And so you just answer those questions, and they're actually pretty easy if you haven't done it already. And they're not real short. They're up there for a few minutes, just so you know. So you should have a chance to see them. But very important that you click on the answers. Once again, thank you for all the sponsors. You can see Brittany has put up the background slides and was running some of the ads, during our break sessions. And you can see we have quite a few sponsors. So very much appreciate all the help for the sponsors. People have been asking us in the chat about how can I get a copy of the presentations. And as we said before, but we'll repeat it, they'll be available on the PAMIC website once the seminar concludes, and a link will be sent to all registered attendees so you can get there easier to download those and maybe share them with your colleagues or keep them for your own notes. So that's all the housekeeping items, and we're very pleased today to have Charlie Kingdollar speaking on emerging issues. And as far as an introduction, many people on the call and throughout the PAMIC community remember Charlie for many years with his gracious time when he was at Gen Re of presenting many issues on the emerging issues topics. I kid him all the time that I hate it when he's always right. He might have been a few years early in some of the things he was looking out for, but that's the nature of emerging issues. But I remember hearing him speak on things like SARS and Ebola and things like that. And here we are all at home in the pandemic still. So it makes me want to listen more to Charlie, and we're so glad he was available. In case you're wondering how we found him, he makes a mistake of occasionally publishing emerging issue articles on LinkedIn still. We saw those and we found him, and he was gracious enough for his time today. As many of you know, he worked many years at Gen Re. He's technically retired, which we're trying to change some of that with items like today. And when he was there, he was the Vice President Emerging Issues Officer and the go-to futurist for the insurance industry. Like we said, not only did he speak at PAMIC, but any of us that traveled this sort of the industry circuit, whether it was PCI or the NAMIC activities, we always saw Charlie there, and he became a great friend to many of us. Again, on these important topics. Whether we were all in CBCU, you'd see him at those meetings or chapter meetings around the country. He also noted on a recap that I think he was in 14 countries over time, and a lot of his literatures that he wrote or the papers he wrote were translated into other languages. So quite an accomplished career, and we're anxious today to see what he sees as the update on emerging issues. So Charlie, with that introduction, thank you for participating, and the floor is yours.
Thank you, Tim. Let me try and get my presentation up here. And it does not seem to be working.
There we go.
There we go. Hold on.
And for those that have questions, make sure you can use the chat feature. And Charlie's okay if we interrupt him. So if you see something that's a question, go ahead and put it in the chat and we'll work it into his presentation. Go ahead, Charlie.
Absolutely. Tim, I'll count on you to read the chats and you can read the questions to me. Thank you for the kind words in the introduction. I'll try not to destroy that reputation today. I'd like to thank PAMIC for having me back. It's been a while. I'd like to thank Andrea and Brittany from PAMIC for the help they have given me as I am still technologically challenged. I changed my introduction today on emerging issues because Deloitte just came out with a survey of chief underwriting officers at a number of property casualty insurance companies. Now, it's a small group. They got responses from 19 chief underwriting officers about how underwriting should change. And two of the three trends were, and I apologize because I'm going to have to read it. They said that underwriters are being challenged to move from hindsight to foresight. Rather than relying on historical data, underwriters need to move toward actively monitoring the impacts of new risks on how that's going to affect their portfolio. So to me, that's screaming underwriters need to pay more attention to emerging issues. Now, the third of the trends they found is the nature of risk is changing. And they say that's thanks to, and then they go on to name a number of emerging issues: climate change, automation, the gig economy. So they're saying that the nature of risk is changing because of these emerging issues. Now, the third trend they said was about data, because no one's saying we should abandon data, because with emerging issues, there is no data. They don't show up in the loss runs yet. But they're saying that there's going to be more data available coming from more sources, and we need to be able to jump on those. And they're talking about data from driverless cars, from the Internet of Things, from various sensors. But I'm not sure the insurance industry at this point is going to have access to all that data. We might ultimately have access to all of it. I just don't know. But I wholeheartedly and have been touting for 40 years that underwriters need to pay more attention to emerging issues. But let's keep in mind that there are at least a couple of hundred emerging issues. And I say at least because when I was tracking them, I said pesticides and herbicides were one emerging issue. If you start going down the list of glyphosate, atrazine, dicamba, I mean, you're going to get dozens. Same thing with, I had exposure to nanomaterials as an emerging issue. If I started saying, well, you got carbon nanotubes, carbon nanofibers, carbon nanowires, dendrimers, buckyballs, I mean, you're going to get dozens again. So I say there were at least a couple hundred. Now, underwriters in the room, I'm assuming you already have a full-time job and you are compensated by the business you put on the books and how well you put the business on the book. Are you really going to have time, even if they split it up and each underwriter is responsible for 5 emerging issues? I don't think you're really going to have time to adequately monitor them. So what does that say? If underwriting is changing in that nature, it seems to me you need to have somebody help you with that. All right, so we're going to move on. Well, emerging issues, by definition, black swans, by the way, occur very infrequently. Emerging issues pop up all the time. I've started to hear some people in the industry call them casualty catastrophes, and that's generally emerging issues that have a long tail aspect to them. But that's only a subset of emerging issues. Things like automation, the 4th industrial revolution, driverless cars, none of that falls under casualty catastrophe. So casualty catastrophe is just a subset of emerging issues. Emerging issues have already cost us, the industry, hundreds of billions in unexpected claims. So it's remarkable to me that we don't spend more time looking forward to try and determine how these emerging issues will impact our company's book of business. And I will guarantee you that it will cost us they will cost us hundreds of billions more. Emerging issues arise out of scientific, technological, and medical advances, new products, changing social mores, new or amended laws and regulations, and court decisions abrogating insurance policy defenses. And as Tim mentioned, sometimes these emerging issues can take years or even decades to develop it. So again, underwriters, as you're thinking, am I going to be tasked with monitoring these? You may be monitoring some of these emerging issues for decades. They can impact one or multiple lines or classes of business. They usually involve multiple defendants, but can involve just one large defendant. They usually involve large potential plaintiffs pools, and there's the potential for limit stacking in some 17 jurisdictions where courts have allowed limit stacking. When I first got tasked with doing emerging issues, asbestos and pollution were the 2 big boys in the room. They're still the 2 big boys, as you can see, with the expected amounts to be paid out on your slide. Eventually, lead came up, and then mold. And for a long time, those were the 4 in the billion-dollar-plus club for emerging issues. But I think there's really 2 more that should be in there, and that's sexual molestation claims and construction defects / faulty workmanship claims. And I say that I think these likely are in the billion-dollar-plus club because I can't find anybody in the industry who has tracked what we paid for these. I know the Catholic Church alone has paid $4 billion in sexual molestation claims. And now there's, with look back laws and changes to statutes of limitations in some 15 states, there's another 5,000 suits filed against the Catholic Church, and they expect that to cost another $4 billion. So that's $8 billion. How much the insurance industry has paid of that? No idea. So I think for several decades, there were 6 in the $1 billion plus club, 6 emerging issues. In the last couple of years, there's at least 6 more that popped up. Glyphosate, so far, it looks like it's going to cost in excess of $15 billion. Ransomware, just the NotPetya ransomware cost over $3 billion alone. Pandemic, I know you had someone talk about this already. The estimates I've seen range from 20 billion to north of 107 billion. So, but even if it's at the low end of 20 billion, that puts it right behind pollution as far as the cost goes. Internet defamation and disparagement claims. 3 years ago, when I was at Gen Re, it had already cost a couple of $2 billion in verdicts and settlements. Again, how much of that is paid by the insurance industry? I don't think we know, because nobody's tracking it. But for it to go to from 6 to 12 in just like the last 2 or 3 years, things are moving along at pace, as they say. I want to talk about violence. The United States has got a violence problem. You compare us to any European country, Canada, Australia, Japan, South Korea, we've got a violence problem. And this is not political. I don't care if you're from the left or from the right, Republican, Democrat, it doesn't matter. The insurance industry has a violence issue. And you can see we're just going to talk about 3 aspects. I'm not going to talk about road rage. I'm not going to talk about other aspects of violence, just these 3 for now. Well, the good news is we do at least track what the industry is paying for under riots and civil commotion. And previously, the most expensive event was the LA riots of 1992, which you could see cost the insurance industry $775 million. So if you're thinking about the $1 billion plus club, that one event was $775 million. The protest that occurred after George Floyd was killed between May 26th and June 8th, they expect this riot and civil commotion claims, the estimates I've seen are north of 1.5 billion. So just those 2 events puts it in the $1 billion plus club. But you know what? Cities were experiencing civil disorder before May and after June. So 2020 was probably the biggest year for riot and civil commotion payouts, probably historically. And now what are we going to see this year? Well, we've got Department of Homeland Security, the FBI, and the Counterterrorism Center all saying that 2021 could be a big year as well. We'll see. But the good news is at least we track this. You can find out there's 5 or 6 big years where there was north of 100 million in claims for riot and civil commotion under property policies. Mass shootings. We don't track what mass shootings cost us as an industry. We can't even agree on a definition of mass shootings. The FBI doesn't even use the term mass shootings. They only use the term mass murder. So same thing with that second. Some definitions require 3 killed, some require 4 to be killed. So basically, if you had 25 wounded, nobody's counting. But I think the Congressional Research Service definition of 4 or more shot, injured, or killed in a single incident at the same time in a single location, not including the shooter, I think this definition is gaining more and more traction. So that's the one I'll be using. So 4 or more shot, or shot, killed, or wounded. Now, historically, we haven't really had to pay much attention to this because we relied on favorable liability laws. In many jurisdictions, business owners don't have a duty to anyone to warn them or protect them from the criminal acts of a third party unless the act was foreseeable. And that's the same for an employer's duty to employees in many jurisdictions. Unless the act was foreseeable, there's no duty to protect there. And mass shootings were considered so unexpected, so rare, so infrequent that they were not considered foreseeable. And this played out in the 2007 Virginia Tech shooting, where 32 people were killed. the Virginia Supreme Court ultimately ruled that the university had no duty to protect or warn anybody else from the criminal acts of a third party. And so the insurance industry was fairly protected. But let's see what's happened since then. You can see that every year, you can see the trend. Since 2014, there's been a 127% uptick in mass shootings. And just last year, there was almost a 50% uptick in mass shootings. And I find that kind of interesting, since significant swaths of the country were at least supposed to be somewhat locked down, and yet there was still a 50% increase in mass shootings. But you can see the trend, and the trend is not going in anybody's favor. So over the past 5 years, there's been more than one mass shooting per day. So are they still so rare that they'll be deemed unforeseeable? Well, there were two Colorado courts. One that involved the 2012 Colorado movie theater shooting, where the court found that incidents that were so unlikely to occur in 1984, which might have been the last time the court looked at it, I'm not sure, deemed to be unforeseeable, may not necessarily be unforeseeable today. And then a Colorado appellate court in the Planned Parenthood shooting overturned a lower court ruling that found that the lower court found the shooting was unforeseeable, and the appellate court overturned it. Now, ultimately, what happened in the Colorado movie theater shooting is that even while the judge said that may not necessarily be deemed unforeseeable, the jury found it unforeseeable. And with the appellate court decision in Planned Parenthood, the Colorado Supreme Court decided it was still unforeseeable. But we're starting to see cracks in this defense. And with, if it goes up for more, it's already more than one a day. If it gets up to 2 a day or whatever, God forbid, we're going to see more cracks in this defense. Now, 2 other mass shootings. Of course, the biggest one in the country was MGM Resorts in Las Vegas, where 58 were killed and many wounded. They didn't even let this get to court. They didn't even argue foreseeability. It settled out of court for $800 million. $751 million of that paid by insurers and reinsurers providing GL and commercial umbrella. And of course, that doesn't include 3 years of defense costs. So again, if you're thinking about the $1 billion plus club of emerging issues, this is probably at $750 million already. Now, obviously not every decision is going to be that big. That's an extraordinary event. The 2018 Marjorie Stoneman Douglas High School shooting, where 17 were killed and 17 were wounded, the insurer ultimately had to pay only $300,000 because the court determined that under Florida law, there was only one occurrence, so only one limit applied. In other states, that could be very different. You could have 34 occurrences and it would be 34 times 300,000. But again, what about foreseeability? Was that not argued in this case? I don't know. I don't know if the court dismissed that argument or if the attorneys didn't even bring it up. But we're seeing payouts. And already it's getting very close to the $1 billion plus club with just a couple of these incidents. By the way, in the Colorado movie theater shooting, defense costs were $700,000. So again, when you're thinking about that $1 billion plus club, you can take mass shootings as an individual emerging risk. If you combine it with violence and you combine it with already the several $1 billion that riots and civil commotion cost, it clearly is in that $1 billion plus club. And so far, we've talked about mass shootings. There are far more shootings than just mass shootings. Almost 45,000 a year, either accidental or malicious, and not including suicides in any of these figures. So you have 2 people shot at a bar and they had a bouncer at the door. There could be suits against the bar. And now that many states are allowing guns in colleges. Well, I've got kids in college and I got to tell you, the amount of partying they do is a lot more than it was when I was there. And I tried to do my share, mind you. And I just don't think a bunch of drunken people with guns is probably a smart thing. But we're seeing this, and I don't know how many of this results in litigation or lawsuits. Some of it's going to end up under workers' comp if they're injured at work. So, but we're not even talking about this segment. The third segment is workplace violence. And the points here I want to highlight are, it's the third leading cause of fatal occupational injuries in the United States. And still, according to the American Journal of Industrial Medicine, it is still very underreported. Well, you can see workplace violence has held steady over the last 9 years or so, with between 400 and 500 killed every year. I expect 2020, we might see a dip because, again, many businesses were closed down for extended periods of time. So we may see a dip in 2020. But again, we didn't see a dip in mass shootings, So we'll have to wait and see. But look at workplace assaults, not fatal, but injuries from assaults. And you can see the trend is up 127% since 2011 and up just about 10% from 2017. You can see the trend is up every year. I don't know how much of this is covered by workers' comp. I don't know how many of these ended up in litigation. It's not something the industry tracks. But again, when an emerging issue under violence, so under the umbrella term of violence, costs us billions of dollars, why aren't we tracking it? Well, there's lots of potential defendants involved in these shootings. Gun manufacturers I put there, but we know that gun manufacturers have immunity from liability currently. Whether that changes or not, I don't know. You would think gun shops and retailers have immunity, but there have been several $1 million plus settlements by gun retailers. This impacts multiple lines of business and is even generated now specialty coverages, active shooter coverage or workplace violence coverage. All I could recommend on those is that the coverages I've seen, the language varies dramatically. So keep that in mind. So do we track claims arising from violence? Well, we do for riot and civil commotion, but that seems to be all we track. So we track it on the property side. We don't seem to track it on the casualty side. And by the way, we talk about violence and civil commotion. The Nashville bombing, they deemed that was not domestic terrorism. So where will that be covered? Vandalism and malicious mischief? Maybe. It wasn't arising out of a riot. Was it civil commotion? Maybe. But so if we're counting, if that ends up getting covered under vandalism and malicious mischief, some percentage of what we pay out for that is also going to be caused by violence. So we don't cover mass shootings. We don't track the cost of mass shootings. We don't cover workplace violence. Do we treat guns just like any other exposure? Well, I think we're beginning to, but many insurance companies don't. And I'll give you an example. We had an insurance company who wrote personal lines. They wrote homeowners, personal umbrella, and they paid $2 million in losses from 1 year from trampolines. They had application questions about trampolines. They paid $2 million for losses from swimming pools, and they had questions about swimming pools. That year, they paid $11 million because of shooting victims. Not a single question about guns. Again, violence comes from the right and the left. Certainly riots and civil commotion comes from the right and the left. It's not a political question. No one is saying people don't have a right to have guns. But as an industry, it's costing us billions of dollars. Shouldn't we want to know? Shouldn't we want to underwrite the exposure like we do any other exposure? I'm going to switch gears and talk about e-cigarettes and vaping because I think it's another $1 billion plus emerging issue contender. They were invented in China in 2003. They came to the US the end of 2006, beginning of 2007. By 2015, the American firm Juul Labs dominated the US marketplace. And Some of the vaping fluids from Juul contain twice as much nicotine as the previous brands did. Use. 8.1 million US adults in 2018, according to the CDC, were regularly using e-cigarettes. And of course, millions of children. We still don't have a good handle on that. According to these two surveys, somewhere between 25 and 33% of high school kids use e-cigarettes, and about 5% of middle school kids use e-cigarettes. Well, there have been injuries, especially in e-cigarettes made in Southeast Asia. Their lithium-ion batteries tend to overheat and cause explosions. This has resulted in house fires, and it's resulted in bodily injury. It's blown up in people's hands, in their pockets, in their mouths. One such suit, the device blew up in someone's mouth, and the e-cigarette manufacturer was domiciled in China, leaving only the US online retailer in the liability chain. In that case, settled for $2 million. Another acute injury called E-Valley, or e-cigarette and vaping associated lung injury. This happened after people started vaping for just 1 to 3 months. And you can see there were 68 deaths by the beginning of 2020 and 2,800 hospitalizations. Many of the people were hospitalized more than once. They'd get released from the hospital and their symptoms would get worse again, and they'd be rehospitalized. Some face a lifetime of serious respiratory effects. One that stood out to me was there's a 17-year-old who had vaped for 3 months, and he was hospitalized. He now has the lungs of a 70-year-old. So what's it going to be like for him when he's 30, 40? It's a shame. So many of these people who came down with E-Valley were vaping marijuana, but 13% that they only vape tobacco products. They still don't know what in the vaping fluid caused E-Valley. They're still trying to figure it out. And of course, litigation has ensued. It's been fairly quiet, and I'm not sure if that's because the courts have largely closed down because of COVID, or if these have been settled out of court quietly, and I haven't seen anything reported on it, so that has gotten very quiet. But while these acute injuries, I'm getting pop-up questions on my screen. Give me a second. Let me get rid of it. Thank you. All right. So while there are acute injuries caused by e-cigarettes, latent illnesses are probably going to be a greater concern. Now, I only went through studies that have popped up in the popular press from May of 19 forward to today. But there are dozens, I'll let you read most of it on the slide, but there are now dozens of studies that associate vaping with serious adverse health effects. You can see here metals coming off the heating coils, causing lung scarring. You know what else causes lung scarring? Asbestos and with mesothelioma, that's lung scarring. Yeah. Another study for Juul, 46% of Juul products were contaminated with the microorganism glucan, which can cause long-term lung damage. Recent studies, again, find 6 substances in the urine of those vaping with strong links to bladder cancer. Oxidative stress result in blood vessel damage and heart disease. Again, I'll let you read. You don't need me to read the slides for you, but again, links that could cause cancer. Study finds vaping fluid again causes lung scarring again. And the most recent study I've come across said that it disrupts gut bacteria, causing leaky gut, which causes a variety of different ailments, including certain cancers and dementia. So the latent illness potential, especially in 17 states that allow limit stacking over policy years, is huge. So again, there's another latent illness thing. Some of you may have heard of diacetyl, a synthetic butter flavoring. When inhaled, it causes bronchiolitis obliterans, which does what it sounds like. It obliterates your lungs. And you may have heard of this because it was initially called popcorn lung, because it affected microwave popcorn workers who were inhaling diacetyl because it was the butter flavoring used in the facilities making microwave popcorn. Diacetyl has already cost the industry, well, there's been about 300 million in verdicts and settlements and probably another 300 million in defense costs, so roughly $600 million. Again, if you're thinking about that $1 billion plus club, that's well on its way. But somebody thought it was a good idea, after knowing that it causes bronchiolitis obliterans, that it'd be great to put it in vaping fluid, which of course one inhales. So they did tests, and a significant percentage of vaping fluids contain diacetyl. So that seems to me just litigation waiting to happen. Litigation has already begun. Juul Labs is facing litigation that's similar to what was filed against the tobacco industry by states, municipalities, school districts, healthcare companies, hospitals. As a matter of fact, Juul has laid off nearly half of its employees. I think they're feeling the litigation costs already. These suits allege bodily injuries, but also public nuisance and deceptive marketing and targeting youths in their marketing campaigns. Potential defendants. Well, again, in the first several years, I don't know, 7, 8 years, Chinese manufacturers dominated the marketplace. Today, foreign manufacturers still make up 25 to 30% of the US marketplace. Those manufacturers, whether they're manufacturing the e-cigarette device or whether they're manufacturing the vaping fluids, might be out of reach for many US plaintiffs. That will only leave US entities in the liability chain. Potential defendants. Again, you can see the list there. Distributors. Here's the thing about distributors. Let me go back. As we've seen in other emerging issues, Chinese drywall, ephedra, other emerging issues, distributors have declared bankruptcy relatively quick, leaving predominantly only the US retailers in the liability chain. And there's a lot of US retailers in that liability chain. Now, the 12,000 to 15,000 vape shops, I admit, is pre-pandemic. Maybe they've all made it through the pandemic. Maybe half of them haven't made through. I have no idea. But in addition to the vape shops, and you might think about tobacco shops if you're looking at a risk, these things, vaping fluids, they're sold everywhere. I was in a car wash and they had racks of vaping fluid pods there for sale. So, ISO does have now, since 2018, they do have exclusions for this. They're not mandatory exclusions. And you may say, well, I don't write vape shops, and my risk appetite isn't, I don't write vape shops or tobacco shops. But if you write retailers, do you have an application question asking if they sell e-cigarettes or vaping fluids? Some of these are going to be written on BOP policies or CPP policies. And we know there's not a lot of questions on those. And there's certainly no questions about e-cigarettes or vaping fluid. And there's not a lot of underwriting and not a lot of premium. Those risks could be the only ones left in the liability chain for people who need double lung transplants, who have lung scarring, who have cancer, and limit stacking over policy years.
Hey, Charlie, we had a few questions if you want me to bring them in.
Okay, I want to know if John Stone is in the audience, the questions all can go to him.
The one is, could you comment, you talk about these different chemicals, and what I recall over the years, you talking about the federal agencies and sometimes maybe what we say the lack thereof. Can you talk a little bit about your experience with like the FDA that's supposed to be monitoring some of these things, or I don't even know who would monitor the items in these the vaping or the e-cigarettes? Do you think we're doing a better job of looking at that now versus in the beginning where they didn't even know what it was? If I remember your early stories on that.
Well, I'll be kind and say it's spotty. Oftentimes they rely on the manufacturers to give them the information. I'll give you a great example. It involves nanomaterial manufacturers, not a chemical, but nonetheless. I was at a conference and at a nanomaterials conference, and one by one, the CEOs of nanomaterial manufacturers got up there and talked about it. On break, I went up and as I mingled about, I asked them, aren't they worried about any potential liability? Because only one company had handed any information to the federal government about the toxicity of nanomaterials. One company out of hundreds of people who are manufacturing nanomaterials. And I said, aren't you worried about any potential liability? And they looked at me and laughed and said, that's what we have insurance coverage for. Well, again, the FDA didn't have any information. The insurance companies don't have any information. So let's just say it's spotty. I do think that under the previous administration, there has been less oversight than there was previously. Where, if that changes going forward or not, I don't know.
To your point about the manufacturers submitting the information, the data to the regulator, right? The regulator stamps it. We see that, for example, in other areas like Boeing, right, with the famous 7 whatever Max, right? You saw that all that was just sent in and they stamped it. You saw it with the opioid issue that you've mentioned, like with Purdue Pharmaceuticals. I think they just sat there and said it wasn't addictive and they could take the opioids forever, right? So it's interesting you say that's actually translating into many of these. There seems to be a common theme there. None of us want over-regulation. I think everyone on the call doesn't like that, but it seems like no regulation or no oversight isn't good either, right?
The same thing happened with glyphosate, especially when the U.S. Sent just reams of data to the FDA, and the FDA really didn't look at it very much because there was so much of it. They just kind of rubber stamped it,
Yeah. Okay. We have a few more here. Let's see if I can get one's on marijuana and one's on terrorism.
Okay.
Let's see here. Just want to give you the categories. Here's one on how do you see the growing recreational and medical marijuana market also impacting lung injuries and more particularly workers' compensation lung injury claims?
Okay. I'm going to put that off. I'm going to get to that.
Okay.
In my last slide, marijuana is on there, so I'll address that one in a bit.
Okay, and then let's go to the terrorism one. Going back to the terrorism discussion, I sense that government officials are learning that if they use the terms normally found in an insurance policies, that they may be supporting the ability for insurers to rightfully deny claims. Instead, they're using terms that are ambiguous at best or spoken with a particular effect in mind. Can you tell a funny insurance this must be from one of your friends. John Stone interrupted and said, "Can you tell a funny insurance joke?" So these are merged together. John Stone indicates that you're the only person that knows funny insurance jokes.
I don't know any. The job of emerging issues is never good news and never funny, I'm afraid.
Oh, you don't have anything like an emerging issue guys walked into a bar? You don't have any of that? That's what we were waiting on today.
Yeah. No, I'm afraid I don't. I wish I did. If I did, I would have opened with it. But
okay, well, but up to the more serious question about them using the terminology of insurance policy when they describe events. Comments on that?
I don't think, and I could be wrong, I don't think federal agencies are using words with insurance coverage in mind. I really don't. The bombing in Nashville, they decided because there wasn't, they weren't trying to cause fear, like if it was Al-Qaeda causing fear among a population because of a religion so they've got fairly strict rules about when they call something terrorism and when they don't. Now, maybe those rules or those definitions need to be adjusted or amended. That could very well be. I would be surprised if they make statements with insurance coverage in mind. That's just my opinion. I have no facts or anything to back that up. Just my thought.
Yep. Okay.
All right. So I'm going to go back. We're almost done with e-cigarettes. I'm going to go back. So again, with litigation for e-cigarettes, you saw the millions of Americans who use it recently. That doesn't mean people have used it in the past as well and then got stopped using them. You have a huge potential plaintiffs pool. You have many defendants, possible defendants in the liability chain. You have many insurers who are not attaching exclusions because they think, well, I don't write vaping companies or e-cigarette manufacturers. But if they write small businesses, they could still have the exposure. You've got potential limit stacking in 17 jurisdictions and the potential for significant injuries and verdicts and settlements. So this has got all the making of $1 billion plus contender easily. And again, it's something that many insurers are not doing anything about. And I hope that's changed over time. I hope that since I've been gone, that more companies are adding it on just as a matter of course, and not just saying, well, you know, if I run a tobacco company, maybe I'll put in a vaping exclusion or something, or a tobacco retailer. All right, so here's the slide. So I'll go to marijuana first because we got a question about that. I don't think many insurers currently are providing coverage for GL or commercial umbrella for manufacturer for anybody in the marijuana business. Again, that could have begun to change. They were starting to provide property coverage for them, I know. Tim, what was that question again? I want to try and get to a workers' comp. Different states are taking a different tact on whether, first of all, whether it should be covered under employers should have to pay for their employees who are prescribed marijuana. But, you know, if someone's gotten into an automobile crash while they're at work or got injured by some piece of equipment because they were prescribed marijuana and they have to take it in the morning and in the afternoon and in the evening, whatever it is, you know, those comp claims are going to be covered just as if they would be covered if they weren't using marijuana. But I think that with marijuana, the liability issues, everybody thinks marijuana is safe. It's better than tobacco. Well, again, we're setting the bar pretty low. 500,000 people a year die from tobacco. And marijuana, the potential long-term effects of marijuana were very understudied for many years. Now we're starting to study it. They're finding not only physical injury, but psychosis that are associated with use of marijuana. And don't forget, the marijuana, for those of you who are my age, the marijuana of the 1960s, the marijuana of today is many times stronger than the marijuana from the 1960s. So again, with marijuana, I think the big issue is going to be the potential for latency and limit stacking. So that's pretty much what I have to say about marijuana. I'm not going to talk about all of these, but I'm going to start with nanomaterials. I think exposure to nanomaterials is, again, something that the industry is not paying enough attention to. There are many different types of nanomaterials, and it's a good point to talk about tipping points. Where is the tipping point? And it's going to be different for each company, depending on your book of business, the lines of business you write. If there's a toxic substance and there's one study that says, hey, this causes cancer, should you react? I don't think so. By the time you get to 3 studies or 5 studies, should you react? Maybe not. With e-cigarettes, there are now dozens of studies. And I think, again, many insurers still are not excluding or underwriting for that matter. What about when you get to 300 studies showing exposure causes significant adverse health effects, inhalation, ingestion, even dermal exposure? Well, that's where we are with nanomaterials. Now, you may think, well, we've got absolute pollution exclusions or total pollution exclusions, but you know what? There's some 15 jurisdictions where that absolute pollution exclusion doesn't work. And it doesn't work for products. It doesn't work for indoor occurrences. In Maryland, it doesn't even work for occupational occurrences. So again, when is the tipping point? Unfortunately, in the past, the tipping point was when those losses showed up in loss runs, when that first $10 million verdict got handed down. And everybody said, oh my gosh, we got to run around and do something. And again, even the Deloitte, I started with the Deloitte study saying we've got to move from just hindsight to more foresight. It certainly seems to me the tipping point should have been before you get to 300 studies. Still no losses, not even litigation at this point that I'm aware of. But nanomaterials, there's more and more of them being incorporated into more and more products. It's got more workers, it's got more occupational exposure than something like asbestos had, and it has a ton of consumer exposure, and which asbestos really didn't have much of it at all. So nanomaterials has the potential to surpass asbestos in the $1 billion plus club. Don't know if it will, we'll have to see, but again, this one has taken decades. I first started writing about it before 2004, still waiting for the litigation. Hasn't come yet. Autonomous vehicles, no latency there. That's actually going to, if they work as they're supposed to, that it would cause less bodily injury, less harm. But you know what? Automobile premium makes up 38-40% of all the property casualty insurance industry's premium. When you add in commercial auto and personal umbrella, which is largely driven by auto, it's probably getting close to half. So if accidents drop by 94% or 90%, if people start turning to autonomous cars in fleets rather than buying personal passenger cars, and, you know, a lot of people are waiting for this to come. Well, it's still years away. It's still years away. No, you've already got autonomous taxis working in San Francisco and in the Phoenix, Arizona area, picking up passengers, dropping them off. Haven't heard about any accident. And believe me, if there was an accident, it would make the news. So we've already got taxi fleets working. We've got one company that has been sending autonomous tractor trailers from California to Pennsylvania. Come to think of it, I don't know if it's Western Pennsylvania or Eastern Pennsylvania, I can't remember, but from California to Pennsylvania, carrying goods, and they've been doing it for near 2 years now. Again, if that tractor trailer caused an accident, we'd have heard about it. And it's been doing it for 2 years. So this is all much closer than people seem to realize. Yes, it's going to take a lot longer before 25% of vehicles on the road are that way, but it's not going to be a straight line development. It's going to come in leaps and bounds. So it's something we need to pay attention to because, you know, auto is a lot of money for us. I know you had someone talk about cyber attacks, and I mentioned ransomware already being in the $1 billion plus club for emerging issues. The cyber attacks I want you to think about are ones that will actually cause bodily injury and actual physical damage. There was an attempted cyber attack on a water utility in Florida just recently, in the last couple of weeks. And they tried to open up a valve to put more of an additive in the water, which would have poisoned the 15,000 people in that community who got water from that water supplier. Now, it failed. Almost by bad luck it failed, or good luck, depending on how you're looking at it. But it was almost by luck that it failed. But that could have poisoned some percentage of those 15,000 people. Stuxnet, going back to 2008, 2007, where the US destroyed 1,000 nuclear centrifuges that were in Iran to try and slow down their nuclear weapons program. Real BI, the potential for real PD, that could be covered under policies that are cyber silent, as they call them. So, and I think that's this attack on this water utility is a harbinger of many more of these types of attacks to come. Concussions and traumatic brain injury, I will say those of you who are only writing business in Pennsylvania, you are among the lucky ones because schools in that state can't be sued for this. If you're writing business next door in New York, there's no immunity, there's no liability caps, it's wide open. In Pennsylvania, you can't even sue for it. So if you're a single state writer, although we are seeing concussions come up in automobile accidents, they're adding concussion to the list of illnesses because, again, blows to the head, there seems to be a correlation between dementia-like or Alzheimer's-like symptoms later in life. So they're adding that into automobile accidents to raise the value of any verdict or settlement. Again, I'm not going to talk about all of these. The fourth industrial revolution is basically automation, robotics, the Internet of Things. That's going to change things in a big way. Fracking, I will mention fracking only because there was just a study that came out about, well, within the last couple of weeks, and fracking is big in parts of Pennsylvania. And what they found is that, actually, I'm going to scroll down and I'm going to have to remind myself of what it said, but I wanted to get the chemicals correct. Benzene, ethylbenzene, styrene, toluene, carcinogens in the drinking water and in the air and in the bodies of children in their bloodstream living within 5 miles of a fracking well. How many people in Pennsylvania live within a 5-mile radius of a fracking well? So that's something to think about. I do want to point out some new ones that are new. Oh, by the way, what do I think is going to be in the $1 billion plus club? On this page alone, nanomaterials certainly is a possibility. Autonomous vehicles are certainly a possibility. Climate change, clearly a possibility. Cyber attacks that cause actual BIMPD is a possibility. PFAS is a pollutant, usually in groundwater or drinking water, but hopefully absolute pollution exclusions will help save off those claims, except in places where, like Indiana, Louisiana, where the pollution exclusions have not been upheld very much. I want to talk about two new ones because these pop up all the time. Airborne liquid crystal monomers. I had never heard of them before. They are used to make screened devices, iPhones, smartphones, tablets, computers, computer screens, televisions. Okay, so what? Well, guess what? They shed. These are molecular size, they're molecules, and they shed from screens. They are persistent and bioaccumulative. And recently, scientists in Canada and in China did some studies where every place they tested, apartments, classrooms, businesses, hotel rooms, had liquid crystal monomers in the air. And they're bioaccumulative. So we breathe them in, we store them somewhere. They're accumulating in our bodies. Now, I don't know about you, but at work, we would have 3 screens. I use an iPhone. I'm on an iPad all the time. How many people are exposed? And we know nothing about, look, anything bioaccumulating that doesn't belong in your body, probably not a good thing. Probably should be a red flag. But think about the potential exposure. The potential plaintiff's pool is just about everybody. I think somewhere around 90% of the country on a smartphone at this point. It could be huge, but it's very early on, only a couple of studies at this point. It could be a decade or more, 2 decades before we see anything, but definitely worth monitoring. The other one is deep fakes and VOCO. You might have seen recently, there's been a spate of things posted on social media having Tom Cruise do and say a bunch of silly things, except it's not Tom Cruise. Looks just like Tom Cruise, sounds just like Tom Cruise. I couldn't tell it wasn't Tom Cruise, but it was a deep fake, or they were deep fakes. And VOCO is deep fakes just for voices. Somebody can call you and make it sound like you're talking to President Biden or former President Trump or former President Obama, and it's his voice, and it sounds just like him. Deep fakes is video with audio. But, think about it. They are now putting famous actresses and actors' faces on porn, and that degrades one's reputation. Well, you know what? Disparagement, published disparagement under personal injury is likely covered. And disparagement means to degrade a reputation. So this and personal injury could be covered under some homeowners policies. It's covered under personal umbrella. It's covered under GL, and it's covered under commercial umbrella. So how are these deep fakes and VOCOs going to end up impacting the industry? It's going to be interesting to see. Well, I've got 5 minutes. So if there's any other questions on any of the issues here or any other emerging issue, I'm glad to try and take them.
Sure. Charlie, I have one here. as you go through your emerging issues, such as the $1 billion club, you can see quickly that the event happened and then the industry came up with an exclusion. That seems to be the theme. You follow that to the pandemic, right? And everyone was looking for the virus exclusion. So when you're looking at, so those examples would be lead, asbestos, pollution, et cetera. When you're looking at something like nano, right, which is like you're saying, it's in everything we touch, eat, et cetera. It's unbelievable, right? It keeps growing and growing. And yet, a lot of our PAMIC members write BOP policies. So whether they're, sunscreens, that's another one I think over time you talked about. How do you think we get to, above 50? They're using these nano items and they pierce below the layers of the skin, right? Potentially cancer or whatever down the road. If the industry, sort of saw this path that you've been painting for a long time, and you're trying to take something, do you think it's worth the shot where the industry tries to be ahead of for once in a while? In other words, something that's going across all commercial products, as an example. Do you try and draft a nano exclusion, or in this case, maybe go to ISO and like they did with e-cigarettes and try and get them to come around? Because it looks like once the event hits, just like business interruption on the COVID stuff, then it's a bit too late to start avoiding these limits. And in BOP cases, usually it's $1 million limit and often a $1 to $5 million umbrella that goes with that. So I just wanted your thoughts about how to get ahead of it, since we've got a good track record of what's happened.
Well, yes, but let me start by saying I don't think that the answer is always an exclusion. I mean, we see that there's now environmental impairment liability coverage, right? We see that there's now active shooter or workplace violence cover. I mean, if you think, depending on what your company's risk appetite is and what you think your ability to underwrite those exposures, and importantly, to charge what is an adequate premium for those exposures, then the answer might not be to exclude. But in my opinion, when you have something like nanomaterials, first of all, if there's a couple of hundred nanomaterials, it's silly to say, well, I'm going to exclude carbon nanotubes, but I'm willing to cover buckyballs, or, to start picking and choosing of the dozens or hundreds. It's too unwieldy. Nobody's going to underwrite like that. So then you're left with a choice. Can I underwrite the exposure? And for nanomaterials, I think it would be very difficult in that, Tim, you're right. It's in sunscreen, it's in personal care products, toothpaste, shampoos, deodorants, it's in paints and coatings, it's in food contact materials, it's everywhere. And again, you could have foreign manufacturers of the nanomaterial. You could have foreign manufacturers of the personal care product. They're out of the liability chain. Again, that leaves distributors who, again, will go bankrupt fairly quickly, leaving only the retailer in the liability chain. And think about all the retailers who sell those types of products. It's incredible. Now, you have a situation where the absolute pollution exclusion will not always work. Total pollution exclusions don't even work in 2 states. So depending on where you're writing business, can you underwrite that? Can you charge an adequate premium for that? If the answer to both of those questions is no, then it seems to me, then you consider an exclusion, or consider limiting how much in limits you put up, or do it on a claims made basis so there's no potential limit stacking. But yes, you have to think about these things. And I think that's what Deloitte was saying, or at least the chief underwriters they spoke to was saying about, yes, it's important to get ahead of these things. And I got to tell you, I probably retired at the right time, because after doing this for nearly 40 years, there was a client, and I'm talking to him about this, and he looked at me, and his big concern, he said, what's my competitor doing? And this is how I knew it was probably a good time to retire, because I looked at him and said, well, your competitor's being stupid. Do you feel any better? So it was probably time for me to retire.
Well, Charlie, about the former, I think there's some good lessons for the audience. And that is, if you take your one topic you brought up, sexual abuse and molestation, we all know from the Jerry Sandusky case at Penn State, what happened to a carrier in Pennsylvania that had a GL occurrence for many years. And we all know it got stacked.
Yeah, and I should have.
So like you were saying, one way to think about it is perhaps there's a way to do it on a claims made or a sublimit or something, right? To
Right.
alter the damage if something like this would hit.
And you're right. Thank you for reminding me, because when I was going through the first 6 in the $1 Billion Plus Club and talking about sexual molestation, I mentioned how much the Catholic Church had paid out so far, and saying I don't know how much of that was covered. But it's not just the Catholic Church, it's other denominations of religions. It's also public schools, private schools, colleges and universities, the Boy Scouts. I mean, it goes beyond just, I just mentioned the Catholic Church, but I should have mentioned that it goes well beyond that as far as the risks exposed.
Sure. Well, we're almost out of time, but one of your friends here, I think, sent you in a joke. And the question goes, Charlie, do you still butter your bread with mold to show how tough you are? Your friend John Stone.
Always good to have friends in the audience. Always good.
Thank you, John. So with that, unfortunately, I think we're right at the 2 o'clock mark, Charlie. So thank you very much. And especially at the end, bringing in a lot of the items that maybe people didn't even think about. So welcome back to the PAMIC presentation mode, and hope you come back. And thanks again. We'll have your slides for everyone at when the conference is over, and send you reminders. So with that, thanks again, Charlie, and we will go on a 15-minute break, and we'll be back with the post-COVID workforce session, and we'll be back in 15 minutes. So see everyone at 2:15. Thanks, Charlie.
Thanks. Thank you. Appreciate it.
New England Asset Management, NEAM, was built to serve the unique needs of insurance companies.
We've just focused on building out our people, our technology, nurturing our culture, developing our product and our capabilities.
We create highly customized solutions for each of our individual insurance clients.
We think there are universal aspects to being from New England that translate whether you're in Bermuda, London, Europe, or the US.
I think about wholesomeness, I think about hardworking people.
We want to be known as that partner that's easy to do business with, that understands them, and it's someone that they can trust.
We want to be thought of as your thought partner, part of your success, your investment department down the hall. We remain true to our roots here, remain true to our insurance focus, our dedication to purposeful partnerships.
And that continues to be our focus today.
We are New England Asset Management.
Westmont Associates is an insurance consulting firm. If it involves insurance, Westmont can handle it.
We have the ability to understand what our clients want to do, take their innovative and creative ideas and turn them into something that a state regulator can understand and work with.
We have global clients, we have local clients, but we strive to make each client feel like they're our only client.
As an insurer, you understand the importance of fixed income. These investments support the claims-paying ability of your operation. Unfortunately, many investment managers don't take the time to fully understand or communicate just how much is at stake for companies like yours. At Opus, we aim to deliver risk-adjusted results rather than jeopardize your company's financial stability by only seeking the highest total returns. We take the time to understand the role of fixed income within your portfolio. This is one of our key philosophies as an investment manager. This strategy allows us to build a pragmatic approach to risk, a process that plays to the strengths of our investment team while remaining in tune with you, the client. Don't roll the dice. Contact me to learn more about our risk management strategies and schedule a portfolio review. I look forward to hearing from you.
Hi everyone, I'm Tom Greenfield at Berkeley Re Solutions, and we're honored to be supporting PAMIC's annual spring conference again this year. And in fact, we've been proud PAMIC members for over 20 years now. PAMIC means a lot to us. We've always benefited from PAMIC's educational events and very much appreciate their strong advocacy actions. However, it is the fabulous networking opportunities that allow us to connect with all the new friends alike. We look forward to doing all of this in person again real soon. You probably already know that Berkeley Re Solutions supports casualty treaties and programs. We also develop custom turnkey reinsurance solutions. We invite you to check out our newest turnkey programs, which were designed with carriers from across the country. First, workplace violence coverage for commercial insureds, and second, violent event protection for homeowners. Information on both can be found in our website at www.berkeleyre.com/solutions. Please reach out to us for further information, and please enjoy the conference.
Just looking at the clock, we'll be about 4 minutes. We'll be starting up in about 4 minutes. Okay, we have about 2 minutes to go before the break's over. So in about 2 minutes, we'll start. Okay, we have about 1 minute to go. Okay, we'll resume into our next afternoon session. Welcome back, and thanks for staying with us. All right, looks like our participation for both days has been stayed very high, so that's terrific news. A lot of good content. Our next session will be a post-COVID-19 workforce, challenges and opportunities ahead. And we have two speakers that we're glad joined the PAMIC conference, and I will introduce them. We have Mary Fong of Advisors Law Group and Caroline Thorpe of Inquirin. And I'll read a little bit about their backgrounds so everyone's up on the same page. Mary advises employers and employment laws and practices, compensation, hiring and separations, company policies, discrimination, retaliation, and harassment matters. She has represented companies before state and federal courts, the Equal Employment Opportunities Commission, and other administrative agencies. Mary has also served as a research attorney in civil and appellate cases for the Superior Court of California, County of Santa Clara. Mary is admitted to practice law in California and the United States District Court, Northern District of California. She earned her JD from the University of California, Hastings College of the Law. So welcome, Mary. And now I'll read Caroline's. Caroline Thorpe. Caroline is the Director of HR at Inquirin, managing HR functions such as hiring, performance management, payroll, and benefits. She also works with Inquirin leadership on employee engagement initiatives to maintain and grow the company's award-winning culture. She has a Master's of Science in Human Resources and a Professional in Human Resources, a PHR certification. So please welcome Mary and Carolyn, and Mary, you can begin if you wish.
All right, is my slide deck up?
Yes, it is. We see it.
Great. Thanks very much, Tim. Hello, everyone. My name is Mary Fong, and I'm really happy to be here with you all at this year's PAMIC conference to discuss these timely workforce matters in light of the pandemic. We're hopefully seeing the light at the end of the tunnel as more folks get vaccinated and more places are opening up. We're going to discuss today some important strategies and considerations for remote work and returning to the office that may help inform how to proceed. Now I'll pass it over to my co-presenter, Caroline.
Hi, everyone. My name is Caroline Thorpe, and I'm excited to be here as well. We have a wonderful and informative session planned for you. Here are the specific areas that we'll cover in our presentation. We'll discuss topics such as the state of remote work, pros and cons, best practices for a remote workforce, to things like recruiting and training remote workers, and of course, the return to the office. And we'll also discuss safety and vaccine considerations as we plan for this next stage after having lived with the pandemic for a little over a year now. Then at the end, we should have some time to answer some questions. So I will hand it back to you, Mary.
Great, thanks, Caroline. All right, before we get into our substantive presentation, just a quick disclaimer to review with you all. Please note that what we're about to discuss is not legal or tax advice. Our presentation is for general information only. We will be primarily discussing federal law, but there can be state and local law and other rules that apply. So you should not rely on this information to address specific circumstances necessarily. And as always, we recommend consulting with your counsel and other professionals for any specific legal or tax questions you may have. All right, let's start by acknowledging our current state of remote work. As you all know, many of us were forced to quickly shift into remote work quickly, pretty much around the world as COVID-19 shuttered our workplaces. So how is the world's largest work from home experiment doing these days? Some employers face challenges in shifting to telework, while others found it relatively smooth, in part due to technological tools to make things a lot easier. Employers are using tools such as Slack, Zoom that we're all on now, Google, and the like for meetings and communications. And one big question looming for employers is whether to return to the work site, and if so, when that would be, and if not, what does that look like? Some workplaces plan to utilize a hybrid approach. I think that's getting a little more popular, to stagger in-person versus remote work, particularly to encourage social distancing if the office space tends to be pretty full when at capacity. Others, particularly larger companies, have relayed permanent remote work plans or some version of this, such as Google, Ford, and so on. As an example, Reddit, the company Reddit, had announced a permanent remote work policy, but that didn't strictly mean everybody just working from home. The company stated in their blog post that they're discontinuing fixed desks, and instead the office will encourage coffee shop style seating, private space for quieter focused work as needed, and larger spaces such as meeting and conference rooms for teams to collaborate and strategize. Now in San Francisco, where I'm based, many organizations have announced some form of remote work policies. Companies like Salesforce, Dropbox, Yelp, Old Navy, they've been canceling or modifying their office leases. Pinterest reportedly paid an astounding $89.5 million to break their lease a few months ago, resulting in a transition to a more permanent remote work situation. That was pretty big news when that occurred. Let's pause for a moment to look at the state of telework prior to COVID. So here are some interesting stats. We were already seeing a big growth of remote work, 44% growth in the past 5 years. It's pretty significant. We had 3.4% of workers working fully remotely. And a recent poll showing that over 40% of the workforce already worked remotely some of the time, which might be higher than you would have expected. And we're talking about pre-COVID times. Now, some of the reasons prompting the remote work trend were innovations in technology, making it more conducive for work away from the traditional office, including work on the go. I mean, think about the prevalence of the smartphone and how robust it is compared to prior tools we had. We're all pretty much walking around with mini computers in our pockets. The workforce also began placing more emphasis on flexibility, and for some even more than compensation or other benefits. And demographical shifts, depending on industry, location, job market, and such, further supported this greater shift to remote work. And of course, when we encountered COVID last March, that drastically sped up the already existing trend towards remote work, arguably making it part of our new normal as far as workplaces go. All right, there are a number of different types of flexible or remote workplaces that are being offered these days. For general remote work, this can be referred to as telework and telecommuting as well. I'd say these terms are being used pretty interchangeably these days. And here's a factoid for any language buffs out there. Tele is derived from a Greek word meaning from a distance, and combined with work, the word means working from a distance, so telework. Now, some companies offer what's called hot desking when you're not assigned a specific desk necessarily, but you have the ability to go into the office and work from an available spot. Typically, you reserve a desk so you know space is available for you before going in. And this provides options between remote work and then being at the office without the company having to ensure that everyone has a designated spot. Other employers are moving towards activity-based workspaces, such as the Reddit example that I mentioned. These are various areas that are designed for specific purposes. There can be private areas and group gathering areas. The idea behind that is to provide flexibility at the physical workplace in addition to the remote work option. And think of this kind of like a hotel where you can move around depending on what you're working on and what your needs are. Some areas may be quieter than others and more conducive for heads down type of work. And other areas are better for discussion and live collaboration. Now I'll turn it over to Caroline for the next topic.
Great, thank you. So whether it's during the pandemic or on a regular basis moving forward, there are many upsides to remote work for companies and employees. Here are a few, and I also recommend making your own pros and cons list based on what you've observed in your own workplaces, as well as employee feedback from remote workers in your company. One potential benefit is that remote flexibility can increase employee engagement and productivity and lower stress. Aside from the unique stress points that the pandemic has brought, having employees work remotely can be a way to lower stress by giving employees back time in their day that would be spent commuting or getting ready for work. Schedule flexibility can also go hand in hand with remote work, and both can help reduce absenteeism. There are reasons why employees call out of work when they have to report to an office that might not apply if they're working remotely. Things like inclement weather, transportation issues, mild illness, or taking care of someone at home. Schedule flexibility can also help employees tend to other obligations that come up during the day, but still get their work done. Having remote employees can benefit your company because it can help you find talent outside of your geographic area. If a role can be done entirely remotely, it expands your talent pool so that you're not limited to the people who are physically able to be in your office. This expanded talent pool can help you find skilled employees and can help your organization recruit in times of low unemployment. And this can also help your organization increase diversity because you might find candidates from different backgrounds and geographic areas, and can also consider working with different groups or job boards that focus on placing candidates of various backgrounds, such as veterans, caregivers, minority group organizations, recent graduates, retirees, etc. And you might also be able to work with organizations that help place people with disabilities who might not be able to commute to an office. Another benefit for companies and for employees is cost savings. You might be able to downsize your physical office space, like Mary was mentioning, a lot of companies have done, or even save on utilities in your current space. And companies can see cost savings also through reduced absenteeism of having remote employees. And the employees could be saving money as well on transportation, work clothes, lunches out near your office, and other costs associated with being in an office. And having remote employees can also help retention, not only by offering flexibility and work-life balance, but also by making it possible for employees who have to move to keep their current jobs. We've had a few employees who moved to another state and their roles were unaffected. And it helped us retain great employees and helped them not have to decide between keeping their role and living where they wanted. But there are some downsides, especially for employees and companies who have their roots very much in an office setting. Working remotely requires a different approach to working and collaborating, which can be a challenge. And we'll talk more about how to overcome these. But one challenge with working remotely is that it can be harder to keep people connected when they're dispersed. People have less opportunity to casually interact with their coworkers and may feel isolated, especially as COVID restrictions still impact our social lives outside of work. And even without that aspect, employees may not enjoy physically working alone all day. There's also less of a physical separation between work and home. I recently read the saying, "I no longer work from home, I home from work." So the two settings are blending together. And in an office setting, it's easier to see when an employee is working a lot of hours or they're visibly stressed out. And employees might be tempted to work longer hours if their work is right there in their house. And they also might feel like they need to respond to emails right away to prove that they're working, which leads to the next challenge that could lead to this burnout is that you might have managers feel uncomfortable managing people they can't see and that they can't interact with in person. And they might be concerned about employee productivity when they're out of sight. Another challenge with remote work is that there may be more policies around who can work from home, how often they can work remotely, how to handle work from home requests, and definitely more if employees are in multiple states. There are more employment laws to consider. And lastly, having all of your work and interactions depend on technology can bring challenges when that technology doesn't work, which I'm sure we've all dealt with at some point in the past year. If your home and your internet is down, you probably can't do anything or connect with anyone like you may have been able to do in an office environment. If the technology wasn't working, you're still with your coworkers and can communicate with them. So next, we'll talk about how we can overcome some of these challenges and best practices for remote work. So the first one, if you're hiring for a remote or even hybrid role, is to hire people with skill sets that are applicable to working remotely. Remote employees need strong time management, as well as good problem-solving skills, as they may not be able to turn to a coworker and ask every question that they have. Communication skills are also very important, as remote workers usually need to be more proactive about reaching out to coworkers to collaborate and to build relationships. After this past year, chances are that candidates you have had some experience working remotely, and we'll talk more about remote hiring processes later in the presentation. And if you have employees who transition to remote work with mostly in-office experience, you can help them by providing time management training or finding online articles and resources about work from home productivity, and also making expectations clear about things like response time, when people need to be available, etc. Something else that's very important is clear performance measurements. So the challenge of managers thinking, how do I know if people are working if I can't see them? Or remote workers being burnt out by trying to prove that they're working at all times can be helped with clear performance measures for the employee and for the supervisor to show that work is being done and goals are being accomplished. This can also allow for schedule flexibility if employees can have some autonomy in their schedule in order to meet the deadlines on time. Investing in technology is another best practice for remote work. Zoom is a great example of a technology that was adopted when we could no longer meet face-to-face. So think about other communication gaps and how technology can be used to help fill them. For example, we used to be able to pop over to a coworker's desk and ask a quick question. Then someone else who might be involved in that project could come over and start and join in the conversation. So an instant messaging system can allow people to ask quick questions or create groups and channels for specific projects, and your message can go to a few people at once. And this allows for instant team communication without having to have a Zoom call for every discussion. Also important are resources and knowing where to go for information. When working remotely, we might find ourselves needing to be more self-sufficient in problem solving when coworkers aren't next to us to help us. Documenting processes is important to help people find the answers to questions that they have, and also free up other people's time from having to answer the same questions over and over. Work-life balance is an important best practice and can sometimes be a buzzword, but it's important to make work-life balance a part of your culture with flexible schedules, by encouraging breaks throughout the day and that employees take PTO, and having supervisors check in with their team members about workload and their stress levels in one-on-one meetings. Also, especially if you're an executive, it's important to lead by example in this. People follow your lead, and it'll be hard to make work-life balance a part of your culture if your leaders aren't exemplifying it, and people might feel guilty for needing to take breaks. So work-life balance means having a culture around the expectation that working hard and being productive also means taking some time to recharge. And lastly, sustaining a company culture may take more intention and effort than it does in the office. Company culture is built from your company's values and how people interact with each other. So if supervisors and employees spoke frequently in the office, make sure to not lose this connection when people are remote. Have supervisors schedule regular one-on-ones with their employees. Managing by walking around is obviously harder now, but managers and executives can still build those connections by having office hours where they're available to talk to whoever, or they can even call and check in with people and say hello, like they may have in the office. Relationship building and socialization amongst coworkers will also take more effort. There are a lot of different types of virtual gatherings that can help people connect, like town hall meetings or team meetings. Maybe there's an activity or time to socialize in those. One thing that was a hit for our team is fun fact guessing games, and it gives people a topic to focus on instead of just talking about the virus. So that's gone over well. And these activities don't always have to be over Zoom. If you have a collaboration technology, you can use that for fun things too. Some have channels where people discuss common interests or just, socialize and talk with each other like they would in the office. Whatever you decide to do, be sure to have a variety of platforms and activities and get feedback of what people want to see, what activities they like doing. And you might have team members who are really interested in coordinating activities. You can have them help facilitate. And variety and some spontaneity can help keep interest, as something like a weekly Zoom happy hour might feel more and more like a meeting over time. So that's an overview of cultural best practices of remote work. And now I'll hand it back to Mary.
Great, thanks, Caroline. Some very good tips that you've discussed there for remote work practices. All right, next we're going to switch gears a little bit and talk about common employment law considerations for remote work. Okay, let's take this one scenario with overtime. So this is a common issue that can come up for unauthorized overtime. This is for non-exempt remote workers, non-exempt meaning they're typically paid hourly and not exempt from overtime rules. Exempt employees are typically paid a salary. Let's see, so this example, my remote employee is working all the time, including a lot of overtime. We question whether overtime is really necessary to get the job done. And we don't want the employee working outside of regular business hours. What can we do? All right, so the first thing is that if overtime is worked by the employee, I'm going to say that in my experience, more often than not, the employer should probably just pay it. I know that's not an entirely satisfying answer, especially if it wasn't necessarily authorized. In most instances, it's not worth the risk of an unpaid wage claim, though there are exceptions, of course. That's not to say you can't address this overtime or any work hours not warranted by the actual job duties of the position that need to get done. What I would recommend here is to talk to the employee about why the employee is working the hours they're working. Is it that they need additional support or training, or is there some other reason why they're exceeding the expected hours of the job? If it's not a matter of support or training that they need, you want to reiterate the expected hours of work to the employee and what to do the next time that occurs. You want to communicate that overtime must be authorized in advance if that's the case, and tell the employee that they should reach out if they find that they need more time. Again, communication. If it's appropriate, you want to relay the consequences for not adhering to these instructions. Perhaps if it occurs again, that's an appropriate time. It really depends on what your typical practice is with these types of situations. And then if the employee fails to follow those instructions, the company generally can, within its discretion, discipline the employee for failing to do so. You just want to be consistent again with your policies and practice across the board to reduce the risk of some sort of discrimination claim. And that's really true for any employment action, any disciplinary measure. So typically employers should handle this type of situation from a performance management standpoint and not necessarily a compensation issue. I would caution against not paying someone because the employer is irritated, for example, or as a disciplinary measure, and the employer should definitely not discourage someone from accurately reporting the time that they worked. That said, if there is some sort of evidence that the employer has that the employee did not work the hours claimed, those might be instances where the employer may decide not to pay the employee if the hours reported are inaccurate and the employer can demonstrate that. It might not make sense to pay those hours. If the employee is being dishonest about their hours, I imagine most employers will want to discipline the employee for that sort of thing. So all to say that it really depends on the particular facts of the situation, but in most instances, it probably won't be easy for the employer to determine one way or another whether the employee actually worked the time claimed, especially if they're working remote, which usually results in weighing in favor of paying the employee, and then addressing any issues with performance management rather than refraining from paying the employee that time reported. All right, our next employment law topic is expenses and reimbursements. We get a fair number of questions on this topic as well. It's not very clear cut sometimes, which can be frustrating, whether the employer should pay for certain expenses. This depends on a number of factors. There are federal, state, and sometimes even local laws. It also can depend on the employee's rate of pay and their classification. Other factors that could come into play is the reason for why the employee is working from home. For example, if it's being mandated by the government, or is it required by the employer, or is it being offered as a matter of convenience? Another factor is whether the expense is in direct consequence of the discharge of the employee's particular duties of their job. Now, under federal law, there is no express requirement to reimburse employees for remote work costs, but there is a rule that provides that employees cannot pay for work-related expenses when doing so would bring them below minimum wage for non-exempt employees or any required overtime. So for minimum wage, keep in mind, that means either the higher of federal or state or local law, the requirements on minimum wage. And a little employment law 101 is that federal law usually sets the floor, and then state or local laws usually have a stricter standard and a higher minimum wage. So you should evaluate what it would take in terms of equipment and supplies to work from home, especially if somebody makes minimum wage or close to minimum wage, or they have significant work-related costs that they're paying for. And any business expense that cuts into minimum wage and any overtime for non-exempt employees may violate the federal law under the Fair Labor Standards Act, FLSA for short. Now, for exempt employees, as a general matter and best practice there, employers should ensure that business expenses don't cut into the minimum salary required for that particular employee. Otherwise, that can risk losing that exemption, which means the employee may be non-exempt and thus entitled to any overtime worked. Employers should also be cognizant of any state or local laws that require more than this federal rule that we just discussed. For example, in California, all business expenses need to be reimbursed if they're necessary to perform the job duties at the request of the employer. And that's regardless of whether that could bring you under minimum wage or not. For Pennsylvania, I did see from the unemployment agency's COVID-19 FAQ that stated, is my employer required to cover any additional costs that I incur if they require me to work from home, such as internet, computer, additional phone line, etc.? And the agency's guidance provided that for Pennsylvania, no, employers are only required to pay employees for hours worked, and any other benefits could be offered but are not mandatory. So that's a little tidbit for you employers out in Pennsylvania. But I will say that even if you're not in a state that requires reimbursement for work expenses, you might consider doing so anyway. I mean, if your workforce is working remotely for time being just due to COVID, businesses can be saving some money, at least on some overhead, such as maintenance, utilities, and supplies, like Caroline mentioned. So some of those savings could perhaps be utilized on reimbursing employees for working from home. Is workers' compensation applicable to remote employees? Yes, definitely applies to both in-person and remote workers. An employee who gets sick or hurt related to work or during work time is entitled to file a claim for workers' comp, usually. Think of an employee working from home, for example, who trips over their computer cord or develops issues due to poor ergonomics at home, resulting in back pain, for example, or maybe carpal tunnel syndrome. Those could potentially be covered. So you'll want to ensure that your remote workers are working from a place that is safe and secure. And one way to do that is to spell out some ground rules in a remote work policy or teleworking agreement. Just quickly, does OSHA apply to work performed remotely? Now, OSHA has a general duty clause under which the employer is still required to provide a safe and hazard-free workplace, but OSHA doesn't have any specific regulations for working from home. Back in 2000, OSHA stated that it wouldn't conduct any home office inspections or hold employers liable for home offices. And OSHA also holds the position that it doesn't expect employers to inspect home offices. So that's a little helpful because we know OSHA has clarified that it's not really going to get into the realm of home offices. Out-of-state workers deserve special consideration in terms of employment obligations, and this is relevant today where many employees have relocated during this time of remote work. And this isn't, of course, just for hiring out-of-state workers. If you have a remote work policy that you're utilizing now, there may be some folks that have moved out of state to be with their families, for example, during this time. And sometimes even out of the country. In these types of situations, the employer may need to register with the state that the employee is working from and withhold those state's taxes. There can also be insurance obligations for that state's unemployment or disability benefits if that exists. Those usually come out of payroll taxes, but not always. And you also want to make sure that your workers' comp will cover that out-of-state worker. And keep in mind that this is important because employers don't realize this sometimes, but the general rule is that the employment laws of the state or jurisdiction in which that person sits applies to that individual. That means if you have these out-of-state employees, there could be employment rules that apply to those folks that are different from the typical rules that apply for in-state workers. So as an example, if you're an employer in Texas and you hire an employee in California, or your employee from Texas moves to California for time being, or maybe even permanently, you're probably going to have very different rules when it comes to things like overtime, meal and rest breaks, leaves of absences, business expense reimbursements, notice requirements, and so on. Admittedly, my specialty is not in tax, so as to any tax issues, I defer to those professionals' guidance on out-of-state or multi-state tax issues. So if you have employees that are working out of state due to COVID or otherwise, and you haven't figured out these tax issues, I recommend talking with your accountant or tax attorney. And these can, of course, become trickier if employees are permitted to work out of state or nothing's been said about whether you can do so or not, in which case you may not even be aware of where your employees are currently. And if you're in this situation, you'll need to figure that out and determine how you're going to proceed, whether you're going to permit out-of-state work or not, and then take it from there. All right, now I'm turning it back to you, Caroline.
Great, thank you. So recruiting and interviewing remotely look different without handshakes and in-person meetings, but the fundamentals of speaking with candidates to evaluate if they're a fit for the role are essentially the same. Here we'll discuss some areas of recruiting that might be a little bit different when recruiting remote workers. So first, in the job posting, it's important to be clear about how remote the role is, especially if you're recruiting now, as we're still in the pandemic and might still be working remotely. Determine if the role is remote for now, but needs to be in the office after the pandemic, or if there'll always be flexibility to be remote or in office, or if it's permanently remote. This will help set expectations for the new hire so that there aren't any surprises after they've been working for you for a few months. If the role is permanently remote, you can expand the geographic area of where you find candidates, which many job boards now allow you to do for remote roles. You can also work with schools outside of your area to find candidates through career services or alumni associations. Communicating technology requirements is also important. Office employees usually don't have to worry about this too much. Whoever handles IT at your company usually sets it up at their desk and it's ready to go. But remote work makes technology a little more complicated. So it's important to outline what the company will provide and what the employee might need. Reliable internet is most likely a requirement, but you might provide a laptop and cell phone, or maybe you require an employee to use their own. So it's important to have a policy around that and make sure that it's clear in the job posting. Remote work, like we said, can lend itself to a more flexible schedule when people aren't in the office that they have to commute to. So it's important to be upfront about the flexibility that you offer, as it can help the candidate understand what their schedule will look like and can help your company have a competitive advantage in recruiting. So next we come to the interview process. It's important to define what your interview process will look like, what questions you will ask, who will be involved. Coordinate each step of the process and communicate with everyone involved, especially the candidate, which steps might be done by phone, which will be by video conference, so that everyone can prepare accordingly. And in the interview process, take a look at your interview questions and consider adding or adjusting some questions to focus on remote work, as well as asking questions about self-motivation, problem solving, communication, and time management. And this is where behavioral interview questions are very helpful, because you can ask questions about their remote work style, like, tell me of a time you were unsure of something and how you sought out the answer, and how do you prioritize your day, so that you can hear specific examples from the candidate about how they might work remotely. And company culture questions are also important, like what their expectations are from their supervisors and their coworkers, to make sure that what they value aligns with your remote culture. Which brings me to the next point, is making an effort to represent your company culture to prospective candidates. During an in-person interview, candidates can get a glimpse of your company culture just by interacting with and observing people when they come into the office. In a video or phone interview, the candidate's insight into your company culture is limited to the interactions with the people involved in the interview and whatever they're able to find online. So you can consider adding a section about your company culture and values to your corporate website, maybe a Glassdoor or Facebook page, wherever you have information about your company that prospective candidates might see. And in the interview process, be sure to also talk about company culture, and you can also include what you've done to help employees in this past year, like flexible schedules or the virtual events that you have to keep people connected, because showing that you have a strong culture and care about your people, especially through a really turbulent time, will be an important factor in attracting and retaining remote candidates. Another way to give candidates a better idea of your culture is to have a future peer involved in the interview process. It can add credibility to your interview if an employee, a current employee, can echo what the candidate has heard and seen about company culture. And the last point that I wanted to make is that keeping resumes and interview notes is still important, and an applicant tracking software can help centralize these hiring documents, and some might be able to help you sort resumes for qualified candidates. So this can help your HR department save time, as they might receive more resumes than usual, especially if you are expanding the geographic area that you're recruiting from, and extra especially during an economic downturn. So once you've selected your new hires, it's time to get them onboarded. You could go to the next slide. Okay, great. So starting a new role can be nerve-wracking, as new hires are trying to absorb information and build relationships with new team members. And it can be even more intimidating to do this in a remote setting. So take a look at your current onboarding process and determine what needs to be adapted to be successful for a remote hire. Preparing the technological logistics of remote onboarding is key to making sure that the new hire's first few days run smoothly. So work with IT on what hardware and software the employee will need and make sure that it works so that the new hire's first impression of their new job is not that they struggled with technology all day. Also, once that technology is set up, making sure that they have any troubleshooting documents that they need and they know who to contact if they have any issues. New hire forms are also an important part of the onboarding process and can be a little bit more difficult when you're not in person to sign pieces of paper. So these can be done through an HR information system, can be signed and scanned back and forth, or even through the mail. It's important to pay attention too to the remote I-9 regulations. There have been some temporary COVID-19 guidance that was posted, or even there's always guidance around doing this remotely, like you can have a notary be the authorized representative. So just paying attention to what rules apply to that is very important. Next, we have the new hire experience. So take a look at how you make new hires feel welcome and how this can be done remotely. Consider sending them a gift box with company branded items or things that might be useful for working from home. And also be sure to coordinate meet and greets and maybe a virtual social company event in their first week so that they can meet and become acquainted with their supervisor and people that they might be working with. Another idea is to assign a peer mentor who's also working remotely, who they can talk to about how onboarding's going and answer questions. And it can be especially helpful if the new hire is adjusting to remote work for the first time. I'm part of a HR networking group, and we had a meeting this morning where someone was sharing that a challenge that their new hires had was that if they had a question, they would type it out in an email to their supervisor because they're remote. If they were in the office, they might just turn to a coworker. And they said that sometimes reading the email, they felt like it was a silly question and they didn't ask their supervisor. So this is where a peer mentor can help, where they can ask these questions and run things by them so that they're not asking the supervisor all of their questions. Another major aspect of onboarding is training on the role that they're hired to do. So as you train people on their role, make sure that there's training documentation that they can refer to later if needed, as well as contact information for people to go to for help in different areas, since they aren't able to walk around to find someone to answer their questions. As you plan the new hire's first few weeks, it's important to create a training schedule so that they can see what their days will look like and won't have to worry about not knowing what to do with downtime in between training sessions. And supervisors should also set goals for what the new hire will learn each week and be clear about what tasks the employee is responsible for completing after they learn them. And you can have the new hire also train with other employees and using screen share tools to help the new hire observe what the trainer is doing and vice versa. A trainer can observe the new hire's screen through these screen sharing tools. Having frequent check-ins with their supervisor is important in the first few weeks, especially since they can't casually check in passing like they could in the office. Supervisors can answer outstanding questions the employee has, as well as give the employee feedback so that they know they're doing a good job or how they could be doing something better. So now that you have remote employees, how do you keep them engaged and retain them? So next we'll talk about engagement. So as companies may be also offering remote flexibility in your industry, how can you make your company stand out? As we've realized during this pandemic, company culture runs deeper than our office environment. Employee needs are still the same, but meeting these needs requires a new approach with remote or hybrid workplaces. So we're going to take a look at the key areas of employee engagement. This list comes from research done by Office Vibe, but there are other similar lists like the Gallup Q12. And I encourage you to think about how these areas can be focused on in a remote workforce and what gaps you might need to address. And these are in no particular order, but we have relationship with managers, meaning that there's trust, communication, collaboration between managers and their employees. This is where regular check-ins and team meetings are important. Recognition, think about recognizing employees in virtual meetings and events through your online communication tools, and encourage not only supervisors, but peers to give recognition to one another as well. Feedback. Are employees receiving meaningful feedback? Is their feedback being heard? Regular check-ins and performance reviews between supervisors and employees where both give each other feedback, as well as town hall meetings or using surveys or suggestion boxes to gather feedback from people can be applied to this area. Personal growth, that employees have a sense of ownership over their role, have opportunities to learn and grow, and see the purpose of their work. This is important even if employees don't have the traditional face time that they would in the office. Alignment, do employees feel connected to your company's mission, vision, values? This may be something to proactively talk about in meetings, in how what people are working on is further driving these areas. That satisfaction, this one includes compensation and benefits, as well as satisfaction in their role and work environment, which is now how they communicate with one another as opposed to a physical office environment. Relationship with peers is very important, that they trust each other, communicate, and collaborate. So it's important to give people the tools to communicate with their peers for work and socially, and to build working relationships with people that they don't interact with in person. Wellness is related to stress and personal health, both of which are major areas of engagement as the pandemic continues. Employees need to see that their company cares about their personal health in these return to work considerations. Happiness is sense of fulfillment and accomplishment, as well as the importance of work-life balance that we discussed. And ambassadorship. Are they proud of where they work, and are they likely to speak positively of your company? So whether your employees are in the office or working remotely, employee engagement initiatives should revolve around these key areas, and you can implement employee engagement surveys as well to determine strengths and areas of improvement for your company. So next we switch gears into returning to the office. So when it comes to deciding on when and how to bring your employees back to the office, there isn't necessarily a right or wrong answer, given that health and safety precautions are taken and policies equally apply to everyone. So it's important to evaluate how bringing employees back to the office will affect your business and your company culture. So it's important to weigh the benefits and risks of returning to the office. Think about what challenges your business is facing because of remote work that can't be overcome, and how bringing people back to the office could fix these problems. Compare the benefit of having people in the office to what risks that bringing people back could bring. Like, what would happen if someone came to work and then let you know that they tested positive for COVID? Also think about the costs of things like office reconfiguration, of the time spent planning and monitoring health and safety involved in the return to the workplace. As COVID cases continue to decrease and restrictions are lifted, evaluate if the benefits of bringing people back outweigh the risks and the cost. Part of the success of a return to work plan is employee buy-in. You can gather this feedback from employees through surveys and discussions about if people are comfortable with returning to the office with safety precautions, as well as what their concerns might be. This can help you be prepared to address or overcome these concerns as employees start to come back into the office. It can also give you an idea of how many people will be returning if you decide to make this voluntary. And if you're looking to have a phased approach, determine which roles make the most sense to bring into the office and which roles might be able to continue working remotely as you continue to phase in employees. So once you determine your return to work strategy, planning is required to make sure that it's done safely. So follow CDC and local guidelines regarding social distancing, office capacity limits, masks, and all of that. And be sure to outline the precautions employees must follow and make sure to train them on it before they return. The office may be a familiar place for many of us, but we're not returning to the same setting that we left earlier last year. So make sure people are aware of things like conference room capacity and social distancing rules. Also consider the layout of your office and how conducive it is to social distancing and what adjustments might need to be made if it isn't. Also consider the schedules of people coming into the office. Make sure that you can still maintain social distance with the number of people who are there. And you can also consider keeping smaller groups of people in the office on the same days together to limit the exposure if someone does test positive for COVID. So as people return to work, it's important to communicate a policy when people are expected to be in the office and make sure that it's fair and consistent in how it's applied, and always keep employees informed of any policy changes. For example, maybe you take the phased approach to gradually increase the number of people in the office, kind of similar to the phases that we see state and local governments implementing. And this can help employees who understand who can currently be in the office and what the end goal is, whether it's having everyone in the office full time or moving forward with a hybrid workplace. Just be sure to communicate when you're moving to the next phase. In deciding what approach to take, it's important to consider the impact returning to work could have on your company culture. If your employee surveys indicate employees don't feel comfortable coming back to the office, but they're required to, it could be detrimental if employees are perceiving that their health and wellness isn't being considered. If the return to work policy is mandatory, make sure that HR and managers are prepared to handle work from home requests that are likely to come up. Also consider what other companies in your industry and in your area are doing, as you could lose employees to companies that offer more flexibility. And lastly, as COVID cases hopefully continue to drop and restrictions are lifted, keep evaluating what makes sense for your company and for your employees. And again, be sure to communicate any policy changes regarding remote work. So if you are phasing employees into the office or plan to maintain flexibility, you'll find yourself with a hybrid workforce, which we'll be talking about next. So as you start to bring people back to the office, determine how you'll approach remote work moving forward, as it may not be the same as it was pre-COVID. An interesting statistic that I found was a January 2020 Gallup study, so right before COVID, found that employees were most engaged in their work when they worked 60 to 80% of the time outside of the office. So returning to work after COVID is an opportunity to update your policies and maybe provide a more flexible environment than you had pre-COVID. What your hybrid workplace looks like can vary, and it depends on your remote work policy. You can have employees only be able to work remotely with an approved request. Maybe everyone can work remotely a certain percentage of the week, or only have to be in the office for meetings. Maybe you have some of your team in the office all the time and some of them remote all the time, or complete flexibility of employees deciding when they're in the office and when they're remote, as long as they get their work done. And these policies can also vary by role. And there are some cultural considerations in a hybrid workplace, many of which are the same as the considerations in having a remote workforce, because it needs to give those who are remote the same opportunity for success that in-office employees have. If there's a hybrid workforce because remote work is allowed and tolerated, but the culture is deeply rooted in the office, employees who are remote may be lacking in the key areas of employee engagement that we just discussed. They might miss out on important information to do their jobs. They might not have as much opportunity to build trust and relationships with their coworkers and supervisor. And they might not receive the same opportunities for growth if in-person face time is highly valued at your company. Remote workers may also feel guilt for not being in the office, or resentment from employees who work in the office, and isolation if they're not included in the company culture, all of which can lead them to be disengaged in their roles. So whatever your hybrid workforce looks like, we can apply much of what we learned about managing a remote workforce during the pandemic to the hybrid workforce in order to embrace remote work and the benefits that it can bring, as opposed to just allowing it. In order to do this, it's important to have a company culture that everyone can enjoy. Meetings and activities might still happen in person or by video, or a combination of both that cater to both in-office and remote employees. It's important to have documentation that everyone can access for important information, so that in-office and remote employees have access to the same information that they need. Technology is an important part of this. I know we got a question about the different tools, obviously Zoom, as well as Slack, which allows for more than one-on-one messages, but also group channels. I think Microsoft Teams has similar functionality, and it provides ways that people can collaborate with one another if they're not in the same location. Measuring performance, like we talked about as a best practice for managing remote workers, helps managers avoid the out of sight, out of mind perception. If the performance of an in-office and remote workers is measured equally, you avoid favoring in-office workers over remote, and both can have equal learning and growth opportunities. And whatever your remote policy looks like, making sure that it is consistently and fairly applied to avoid any discrimination issues. So these are a few approaches of a hybrid, voluntary, and mandatory return to the office. Whatever your plan is, there will be questions and concerns that come up from your employees, which we'll now have a pop quiz on. It's actually a poll. If we want to go to the next slide, we'll be looking at some specific hypotheticals. So we'll get the poll running, and please respond with the answer that you think is appropriate. So the first question is, an employee comes to you and says, I have asthma and I don't think it's a good idea to return to work yet because of the risk of getting COVID. If I get sick, it could be really bad. Do I have to return to work? So you as the employer, can you require the employee to return to the office in this scenario? Okay, the results are in. So we have mostly saying no, 49%, 41% saying maybe, and 10% saying yes. So I'll hand it to Mary to explain what to do in this case.
All right. Well, I understand the no responses, but the correct response is maybe, because it depends on the situation, as with a lot of these situations. The employer might be able to require the employee to return if the employee is not entitled to remote work as a reasonable accommodation under the Americans with Disabilities Act, the ADA, for example. The CDC has identified certain health conditions that are at increased risk of severe illness from the virus that causes COVID. And those that might be at an increased risk for severe illness may be entitled to an accommodation. Asthma currently falls under the might be at an increased risk and not a certain increased risk bucket, just for your information and knowledge. And here's what to keep in mind for employers. When an employee's health condition is involved, which could impact the ability for them to perform their job, that triggers obligations under the ADA. Oops. All right. So what does the ADA require employers to do? First of all, the ADA applies to employers with 15 or more employees. And the general rule is that an employer is required to provide a reasonable accommodation for someone with a covered disability, unless doing so would cause an undue hardship for the employer. And that's done through what's called an interactive process or a dialogue between the employer and the employee. In other words, it's not a one-sided process. An ADA accommodation can vary from workplace modifications to duty changes, scheduling adjustments, reassignment, or even time off work. So it's a flexible process. And the ADA, although it doesn't apply if you don't have 15 or more employees, there can be state or local laws requiring accommodation for even smaller employers. And even without any of those, I say as a best practice, it's good to provide an accommodation when you can to support your employees. Now, the obligation to provide an accommodation is limited by something called undue hardship. What exactly is that? Now, don't misunderstand undue hardship as being something simply that's bothersome for the employer. It's defined as a significant difficulty or expense based on an individualized assessment of the current circumstances. So it's a balancing test of whether the accommodation that's being considered is truly unduly burdensome, not just a mere inconvenience. It's a relatively high bar, and it doesn't exist merely just any time the employer finds a request difficult. Now, a denial or declining of a request for an accommodation can be fraught with the risk of a claim, whether for disability discrimination or failure to accommodate. So you want to be particularly cautious here. Whether something is an undue hardship is specific to what's going on at the time of the accommodation request. So what may be reasonably accommodated at one period of time may not be reasonable at a different time under different circumstances or with a different employee, for example. And so it's not wise to have a strict predetermined policy on a specific amount of time off for medical leave, for example, or who can and who can't work from home as a result of an accommodation. And these types of requests need to be assessed on a case-by-case basis as they arise. So going back to this employee with asthma requesting to work from home, an employer can request medical documentation so long as it does so consistently for others in similar situations. The purpose of that is to confirm whether a disability exists and understand through a healthcare provider what sort of limitations there can be in terms of the employee and how they perform their work and what sort of recommendation there is to address that limitation. The goal is to enable the employee to perform their duties at their job with an accommodation if that's needed. And that makes sense because a lot of times neither the employee or the employer is a health and safety expert. So we rely on healthcare providers and other professionals to recommend what may be safe and healthy for that particular employee to do or not to do. So here, with a request from an employee who has asthma, the employer would do well to start the interactive process and may want to request medical documentation. And along with that, should also provide a copy of the employee's job description to give to the healthcare provider so they know what duties are involved. And then depending on the employee's limitations, an accommodation may be remote work or perhaps certain protective measures at the workplace, such as relocating the individual to a quieter or less populated area, or even maybe time off. It depends on the particular facts. What if the employer wants the employee to return because everyone else is returning and can take safety measures to accommodate the employee with asthma in the workplace? Will that work instead of the remote work that the employee is specifically seeking? So again, the limitation on accommodation under the ADA is whether it'll pose an undue hardship. But note that the EEOC, that's the federal agency that enforces these laws, they've said that telework, because of the COVID-19 pandemic, could serve as a trial period to show whether an employee could perform their job that the employer should consider request in light of this information. And so if the employee has been teleworking for a period of time, there may be questions about why they can't continue to do so as an accommodation. It could be that if it wasn't effective, for example, or there were technology challenges or decreased productivity, that could weigh into the analysis here. But I do think that overall it'll be harder for employers to show that remote work would be an undue burden, especially if it's done so the past year. But there are no hard rules when it comes to these things. I also want to quickly mention the Federal Family and Medical Leave Act, FMLA or FEMLA, when a health condition is involved. This may not necessarily be related to requests to work remotely because it pertains to leave or time off, but when you go through the ADA framework, it's possible that time off from work can come up as a reasonable accommodation. And if the employee is eligible for FEMLA, that type of time off or leave can be protected both under FEMLA and the ADA. Here's a little bit of background information on FEMLA, which I'm not going to go through in detail, but you have this slide as a reference. So to briefly summarize this example of an employee with asthma, remote work may be accommodated under the ADA, but it really depends on the situation. The employer would do well to start that interactive process if it receives this type of request involving a health condition. All right, Caroline, what is our next pop quiz question?
So a little bit different is that an employee comes to you and says, my child has asthma and I'm worried about her catching COVID. My family and I have been really careful about going outside for this past year, and I don't think it's a good idea for me to return yet. Can I continue working from home? So we'll queue up the poll. Can you, as the employer, require them to return to the office? All right, so the majority said maybe at 56%, 37% said yes, and 7% said no. Mary, what would the answer be here?
All right, this is a tricky one. I say the answer is mostly yes, and that may come as a surprise. The employer can require the employee to return, but whether it should do so is another question. So under the ADA, employers are not required to provide accommodations for a health condition of a family member or anybody else, just the employee's own disability. So technically there's no duty to accommodate an employee due to a family member or even a roommate's health condition just because you live with them. But remember, under FEMLA, if leave is involved, an employee who's eligible can be entitled to leave to care for a family member with a serious health condition. So FEMLA does have some obligations when it comes to family members with health conditions, but under the ADA, that does not typically apply to somebody else with a health condition. So if the employer were to require the employee to return to the office, that would generally be okay unless you have some sort of company policy that provides otherwise. But if the employee, for example, needs to care for a child with a serious health condition, and they just want to take the time off instead of returning to work, they may be entitled to that under FEMLA if they're eligible. All right, Caroline, do we have another pop quiz question?
Yes, one more. So an employee comes to you and says that there's still a lot of people getting sick and vaccines aren't available to most of us yet. They say that they're very concerned about COVID and would like to avoid potential exposure. They've been working from home just fine and don't want to go into work every day, and ask if they can continue to work remotely. So can you, as the employer, require the employee to return to the office in this scenario? All right, so we have 63% saying yes, 24% at maybe, and 12% at no. I'm sure this is one that will come up pretty frequently. Mary, what would the response here be?
All right, most of you folks will be pleased to hear that the correct response is mostly yes here. If the employee merely has a generalized fear of COVID and there is no health condition that's involved, the employee is not entitled to continue remote work as a general matter, even if they've been working from home without a problem, or perhaps they've even exceeded standards that wouldn't entitle the employee to continue in that manner if the employer wishes for the employee to come back to work. But it's certainly something to consider as you start to fashion your return to work plan, especially if some of the advantages for remote work that Caroline discussed earlier are true for your organization. Do you want to continue remote work for a bit longer, or should it be permanent? The employer should also be prepared to face any negative impact on employee relations and morale for declining these types of requests though. But the bottom line is yes, the employer can require the employee to return to the office in this hypothetical. And as for the employee's concerns, our recommendation is to relay that you're operating in accordance with state and local safety and health guidelines, assuming that that's the case. You want to specifically identify what safety measures you've taken to assure employees that these types of actions have been taken. You want to address any specific fears and emphasize that you're adhering to the health authorities' guidance and recommendations. And as a side note, if the employer is not following proper safety guidance that's available, that can expose them to some sort of workplace safety complaint or investigation, including OSHA getting involved. So it's critical to stay informed on the latest developments. Of course, with something like the novel coronavirus, this has been challenging since it feels like everyone is kind of learning as we go along, but that doesn't necessarily excuse the employer's workplace safety obligations. So it's important to follow those. All right, to summarize, so when an employer decides to return to reopen the office and an employee requests to not return and continue working from home, you'll need to determine the reason for the employee's request, whether the employee has some sort of statutory protection for remote work or to not return to the office. That's primarily going to be whether the ADA or FEMLA applies or a similar state or local law. There may be a company policy that addresses the situation, which could also apply. So you'll want to evaluate your general practice and provide clear guidelines on who can work from home or not, and outside that would be outside of a potential ADA or otherwise medical situation. Consistency and fairness is going to be important when it comes to these types of requests, because to permit some and decline others can expose the employer to a discrimination claim. The employer also needs to note that granting an ADA accommodation for remote work doesn't mean that anyone and everyone is entitled to that. I want to be clear that this is an exception made to accommodate an employee's disability, and that's going to be case specific. All right, so next we're moving on to workplace safety, and for the sake of time, I'm going to pick up the pace a little bit more than we have been going, because I want to ensure that you guys also get an adequate break before our last session. So workplace safety is a very broad area, and we're not going to cover all the aspects of the subject. It can easily encompass its own presentation, and but we'll discuss some of the more important considerations for employers here. So reopening the office means careful attention and time devoted to figuring out your safety plan, which Caroline mentioned. Most employers open during this time have had to implement safety protocols and measures. If your organization has been remote, this is going to be new for you. So careful planning is going to be required. In terms of PPE, the latest guidance from CDC suggests double masking can be helpful. So should you require this at the workplace? Maybe. But note that the CDC also says that a disposable mask underneath and a cloth mask on top, but not two disposable masks at once. So you're going to have to be careful about what type of face covering is going to be required at the workplace. The link, oops, sorry. The slide here also indicates other safety protocols that employers have implemented. So you want to think about these things. If you're in Pennsylvania, I encourage you to check out the link here, which provides business guidance for employers. It will address occupancy limits, providing a safety checklist, printable signs, where to source PPE, that sort of thing. Preparation is key, and it's going to go a long way to ensuring the safety of your workplace and for compliance. And Pennsylvania also has industry-specific orders, so you want to be aware of that. I do believe that the executive order for Pennsylvania requiring telework is still in effect unless it's impossible to do so. So if that applies for you, you may not be able to reopen at this exact moment, but planning for the reopening, if that's what you'll be doing, can still be done. So you want to minimize any delay when you do get the green light to reopen. In terms of the ADA and equal employment opportunity compliance, particularly surrounding all of these health-related questions, the EEOC guidance linked here has been really helpful for employers throughout the pandemic. We're going to go through some of the main points as you prepare your workplace safety plan. First, the EEOC notes that public health authority guidance is likely to change, and we've already seen that as COVID evolves, and the EEOC states that employers can and should follow the most current information for workplace safety. Again, you need to stay on top of the latest updates and guidance because of that. So what symptoms can the employer screen for? The EEOC says that employers can rely on the CDC and other public health authorities and reputable medical sources for emerging symptoms. These symptoms can guide employers when to choose what questions and what types of symptoms to select from to ask employees about to determine whether a direct threat to workplace health and safety would be presented. This CDC link here describes COVID symptoms. It was updated in late February when I last checked. So the symptoms listed at the site would be among the permissible symptoms to screen for. It'll be things like fever, chills, cough, headache, and so on. As you may know, employers need to be cautious when it comes to medical inquiries. This is to avoid disability discrimination and ADA rules. So it's helpful to know that you can ask these specific questions of employees without encroaching on ADA rights. Employers sometimes want to know if they can request a doctor's note when an employee is out with COVID and then says they're ready to return to work. Now, there's a little bit of a difference here. The EEOC says, yes, you can require a note certifying for fitness for duty under the ADA, but practically speaking, doctors may be really busy, so new approaches may be necessary, such as relying on clinics to provide a form. And you can contrast this with the CDC, which discourages sick employees to provide a COVID test or a doctor's note to validate their illness or return to work because they may be extremely busy. I think generally if an employee has completed the recommended quarantine and they meet the other requirements for discontinuing home isolation, you should probably be able to permit them to return. But if you require a doctor's note, that should be in accordance with a consistent policy that you apply for all and not just one or some. Can we ask if an employee has COVID or has been tested for it? The EEOC says yes. You can ask this of those physically entering the workplace. You want to be consistent again. As a best practice, you ask this for one employee. It's best that you ask all employees coming into the office the same questions. Okay, what do we do if somebody refuses to answer questions about whether they have COVID or COVID symptoms or refuse to take their temperature? And so if somebody refuses to answer legitimate questions about COVID or refuses to have their temperature taken, the ADA permits the employer to exclude the employee from the workplace. But you might want to ask why the employee is refusing to do that. If there's concerns about confidentiality and privacy, for example, you can assure them that responses are kept confidential, as well as all health information, assuming that's true. If they want to know why you're asking these types of questions, you can relay that you're taking steps to ensure everyone's safety and that these screening processes comply with the CDC's recommendations. Right, do we have to keep COVID-19 information confidential? Yes, confidentiality is critical when it comes to medical information, including COVID-related information of employees like symptoms, temperatures, and test results. The ADA certainly requires medical confidentiality. If you'll be retaining any of this information, you should store this separately from the personnel file to ensure that access to the medical information is restricted and kept confidential. In fact, confidentiality is so important, and this is an important note here, that if an employer has to perform contact tracing to determine if any exposure has occurred, the ADA doesn't permit the name of an employee who is confirmed or suspected to have COVID to be released. So the EEOC says that you should use a generic descriptor, such as someone at this location or someone on the 4th floor has COVID. I mean, for smaller employers, practically speaking, people might be able to figure out who this could be referring to, but that's fine as long as the employer themselves are not disclosing the identity of the employee. And of course, if the employee themselves want to tell other folks that they've gotten COVID, that's their prerogative to do so. But again, the employer needs to be cautious about confirming or revealing any names and not do that. All right, can an employer request an employee to take a COVID test? Generally, yes, you can do that. The ADA requires a medical test to be job related and consistent with business necessity. And if the employee is coming into work, whether that employee has COVID or not is directly relevant to whether they'll pose a direct threat at the workplace. For Pennsylvania, the state guidance at this link explicitly says that yes, employers can require a COVID test, and that's regardless of whether they're experiencing symptoms. Just note that this guidance, the state guidance, also states that if you're requiring a medical examination, such as a COVID test, in order to continue working, the employer is responsible for paying for that examination, unless there's another statute that requires examination as a condition for employment. And it also provides that time spent at a doctor's office waiting for an examination or receiving medical attention at the employer's direction is considered hours worked if it occurs during normal work hours. But time spent during a day off, for example, would not be compensable. All right, this CDC site is a really good resource for employers to follow. The guidance is targeted for businesses specifically. It was last updated March 11th, just about a week ago. So it's certainly being updated regularly. I know that one of the challenges with the pandemic is the changing guidance from the health authorities, but we have to remember this is a new illness and new territory for a lot of us. And so there are going to be regular updates as we've seen the past year. Very useful page, which I personally use frequently. It's the CDC's Workplace FAQ. It's structured in a question and answer format, which I find really helpful. It provides information on common COVID scenarios that come up for businesses. For example, what should I do if an employee comes to work with COVID symptoms? Or when should someone suspected or confirmed to have COVID return to work? All right, let's talk about developing a game plan for when an employee is exposed to COVID or contracts COVID. You'll want to require a quarantine in accordance with the health and safety guidance available from health authorities. Will any quarantine period be paid or unpaid? If the employee can work remotely, they're going to be paid their usual compensation. So that's not necessarily a concern. It's when they're unable to work. Will that be an issue? The federal law that required certain paid sick leave for COVID-related reasons under the FFCRA expired at the end of last year, but employers can still voluntarily provide that benefit and receive a corresponding tax credit through March.
American Rescue Plan Act that was signed by President Biden a week ago makes additional changes to that. It extends the tax credit through September, and also adds new qualifying reasons and makes some other changes, including that the benefit is reset as of April 1st. Previously, if you've exhausted the FFCRA benefit, you weren't able to take another round of benefits and have the employer receive that tax credit, but that's all going to be reset as of April 1st. So if you voluntarily provide it, that is an option for you. And then of course, part of the game plan should be how you're going to perform contact tracing and cleaning and disinfecting areas, and whether any COVID positive cases need to be reported to various agencies and the department and so on. All right, there have been some updates to the recommended quarantine period for certain situations that has caused some confusion. There's a 10-day, 7-day option, but the safest really is still the 14-day quarantine. I put an asterisk here for vaccinated individuals, which we'll get to in a moment. Next, I want to highlight certain types of technological tools that can help with COVID safety at the workplace. As you can imagine, there's a wide range of apps and gadgets and wearables that have been prompted by the pandemic. These things can assist employers with things like electronic contact tracing and temperature tracking and enforcing social distancing. There are also pre-screening apps that are popular with some organizations, where employees answer a questionnaire through their phones before coming to work. And this can certainly help make safety processes at the workplace a lot more efficient. Instead of, for example, manually performing contact tracing, the app can display data to show who's been near whom and who may need to quarantine as a result. So all in all, there's been some pretty cool technological developments in light of the pandemic that are trying to make it easier to keep the workplace safe and help businesses continue with minimal disruptions. All right, we've finally reached our last topic, the COVID-19 vaccine. We now have 3 types of vaccines currently available under the FDA's emergency use authorization, Pfizer, Moderna, and the J&J vaccines, which is very exciting news. The CDC has issued these recommendations on who should get the vaccine first, given the limited availability of it, and then states will be in charge of who is actually able to get it as they see fit. Pennsylvania's phases look a little different from the CDC's recommendations when I last checked. It looked like some of these groups listed here were lumped together under phase 1A. This is the link that you can check for all of the latest information on who qualifies if you're in Pennsylvania. All right, one of the main or initial questions that employers have on this subject is, can we require it? Certainly the sentiment behind this is we want to make sure our workplaces are safe. We're afraid of being exposed at work, and we're all tired of social distancing and wearing masks. It all makes sense at first glance. The EEOC has published timely guidance on vaccines. So luckily for employers, this provides much needed direction. I don't think I've mentioned this yet, but sorry, I'm trying to skip over some of my notes that are not as pertinent. This link I highly recommend checking out if you're thinking about implementing a vaccine policy. Section K specifically addresses vaccines, but there are also other very helpful information with respect to the ADA and other COVID-related topics. So the guidance says that it doesn't specifically say that employers can or can't require the vaccine, but it presumes that employers can do so as long as they adhere to certain requirements. So it's safe to say that the short answer to the question is yes, you can require employees to get vaccinated, but there's some significant caveats to this general rule, including accommodations that can be required for situations when there's a religious or medical accommodation request made to the employer. So for religious accommodations, let's say you have an employee who says they can't get the vaccine because of their religious beliefs, you'll have to see if there's a reasonable accommodation that can be made, whether that's a workplace accommodation or remote work, or even time off work if remote work for some reason is not going to be appropriate. We already discussed the ADA disability accommodation, similar framework here. If they claim they can't get vaccinated due to a health condition, you're going to have to engage in the interactive process to determine if there is some reasonable accommodation that can be made for that. Can the employer exclude the employee from the workplace if there's not an accommodation? It's going to depend on whether there's a direct threat. If you don't permit them to be at work, it depends. It's an analysis of 4 factors. There's not going to be a bright line test. You have to consider a number of different things. For example, is there temporary assignment of job duties that that may not require the vaccination? Maybe it's a reassignment to another position or relocating that person. But I do want to stress that you can't exclude someone unless there's absolutely no way to provide a reasonable accommodation. And again, if you've been doing remote work all the way up to now, that's probably not going to be the case where you cannot come up with a reasonable accommodation for that person. All right, a few quick points about ADA requirements as a mandatory vaccines, even if it doesn't involve a disability accommodation. Questions that draw out information about a disability must be job-related and consistent with business necessity. That means the employer has to have a reasonable belief based on objective evidence that the employee's ability to perform their job will be impaired by a medical condition, or the employee poses a direct threat due to the medical condition. So you have to consider your process for any sort of vaccine requirement. If you're going to require that employees show proof of vaccination by a certain deadline, and someone doesn't submit such proof, and you ask why, that can elicit disability information that you then must justify as being job-related and consistent with business necessity. But we can be assured, based on the EEOC guidance that's been published, that requiring proof of vaccination by requesting a receipt, for example, is not a disability-related inquiry, so it's clear that that's okay. But you have to proceed with caution. This area is a minefield. It can be really tricky when the employer needs to be thoughtful about each step of the process. All right, so what can vaccinated people do? The CDC says you can visit other fully vaccinated people indoors without wearing masks or staying 6 feet apart. You could visit unvaccinated people who are at low risk for the disease without wearing masks or social distancing. And you can also refrain from quarantine or testing after possible exposure. But note that on this last point about avoiding quarantine, there are certain requirements that need to be met. So it's not just a flat out, you can avoid the quarantine if you've been vaccinated. But the CDC says that vaccinated individuals must still exercise certain standard pandemic precautions in public. And so for work purposes, they may still need to take the same safety precautions as those who are not vaccinated. And then don't forget, there's other state and local mandates that can still require a mask, for example. And even if under the CDC guidance, you might be okay without a mask indoors if your workforce is all fully vaccinated, the employer shouldn't be announcing who's been vaccinated or not, because that's confidential information. So there's that wrinkle to consider as well. And it's likely that masking and all your other safety precautions will need to continue. Here are a list of, there are a lot of considerations, as you can see. Obviously, there's going to be a phased approach to vaccine availability. So that needs to be taken into account, how the employer is going to require the vaccine, if at all. This may be an even bigger consideration for multi-location or multi-state employers. And you certainly want to take some time to consider your workforce and how a vaccine requirement will impact relations and morale. People have varying opinions and feelings about the vaccine. I mean, some may resent the employer for requiring a vaccine when, even if they were inclined to do so without that requirement, and others can be nervous about it. So you may want to poll your workforce on how they feel and what they think of the vaccine. It may not be worth going against the grain if people aren't interested or inclined to get that vaccine, or, again, they might plan to get it anyways, in which case making it mandatory may not make much of a difference ultimately. Note that some states also have pending legislation on whether employers can require this or not require this. So if that gets passed and that applies, any vaccine policy could be out of the employer's control. Some states that have such pending legislation are states like Kentucky, Missouri, New York, and a number of other states. I do want to say, though, that employers should consider whether a voluntary policy that recommends vaccination would make sense. I quickly went through some of these, but a vaccine requirement can be fraught with legal risks for certain disability or religious accommodations. And vaccines, the ones that are available here, have been approved under emergency authorization, which is not necessarily the same as full approval. So even waiting until after a full approval occurs can be helpful in alleviating fears about the vaccine being too new. If you do want to proceed with some sort of mandatory vaccination, I strongly recommend working with your local employment attorney to determine whether this is advisable, and you want to have a strong policy in place, including utilizing consent in other forms. And so in terms of timing any return to the office with a vaccine requirement, or just considering vaccinations in terms of workplace safety, I mean, one idea could be to time any mandated vaccine with returning to the office. For example, those vaccinated may return, though of course you have to provide any appropriate accommodations if those are requested. Another is to wait until maybe most of your workforce is vaccinated, if that is something that you can find out. And of course, if your organization is inclined to stay remote, then the vaccine doesn't really matter for workplace exposure. Right, this is just a good resource to check out as you consider how to approach vaccines. It's also a good resource to utilize to educate your workforce on vaccination. Right, ultimately, there's no one-size-fits-all approach when it comes to returning to the office or continuing with remote work. Every employer is going to have to consider what's best for its business and workforce. I do want to remind folks that this is an opportunity to critically evaluate what's going to support the company, how you'll serve your customers, and how you'll support your staff and ensure their safety, particularly during these challenging times. Here are some resources. The slide deck will be available after the conference, and so these are resources just to check out at your convenience. And now we've reached finally the end of our presentation. We have a little bit, actually we are a little over time, so I'm just going to quickly review some of the questions that have come in and address those, if that's okay, Jim.
Yeah, we were trying to fit in a break. We only have 5 minutes. Could you, yeah, that's fine. Can you just do those quickly?
Oh, yes. Actually, there's not too many questions. Does this work for subcontractors? I'm not sure what that is referring to. Sorry about that. But there is a question about resources through Inquire On. Please note that we do offer template policies in our handbook builder. And so that's always going to be a good start if you're thinking about implementing any written policies with remote work. And then one other question about being 1 year into the remote workforce, what tools have you seen used to maintain proper company culture? Caroline's discussed a lot of options that are available. Caroline, do you have anything to add to that one?
No, I think part video as well as part instant messaging, so that not all of your calls are on video, because that can lead to Zoom fatigue. But those are really the two main areas I'd recommend.
All right. I think that's about it. Sorry for going a little over time, everyone. We really appreciate your focus and attention to this topic, and we enjoyed being here with you all.
Yeah, thanks, Mary, and thanks, Caroline. Excellent presentation, and I'm sure people are going to be interested in looking at your slides when PAMIC posts them. A lot of details in there, a lot of nice references for everyone. So perfect. We're going to try and keep the program on time. So while it's only a 4-minute break till 4 o'clock, we have the post-COVID workforce CEO panel discussion coming up next, but I wanted to give everyone at least a couple minutes to stretch a little bit before our last session. Again, thanks for Mary and Caroline participating in the PAMIC conference. And again, great presentation and a lot of fine knowledge would be taken back for ourselves and for our employers. So we'll be logging back in here in a few minutes. Okay, we have about a minute before we'll sign back on. So sorry for the short break on that one. Ran over a little bit on the last one, but a lot of good information. So moving into our panel next, and it'll be headed up by Doug and Dvorak of Inquiron, and he'll be moderating the panel. So I'll do a nice little bio clip so everyone's up to speed on Doug's background, and then turn it over to him. Doug is a Vice President of Product Innovation for Inquiron. He is responsible for new product ideation, development, and market strategies. Doug has over 20 years of insurance industry specific experience, primarily as an attorney. His professional experience includes responsibilities for liability and commercial lines claims for a national insurance carrier. Prior to that, he worked in the insurance coverage litigation practice in the Washington, D.C. law firm of Shaw Pittman, LLP. So with that, I'll turn it over to Doug, and thank you.
No, thank you, Tim, and I'm glad we had that quick break because my Apple Watch told me it was time to stand, so it was perfect timing. So I get to moderate the last panel of the PAMIC 2021 virtual conference. Fingers crossed next year we're all together and actually in person at the Nittany Lion Inn or somewhere good where PAMIC decides to host. But I've got a great all-star panel, which they'll be doing most of the talking during this because they're the experts, but I'll introduce them and then I'll set the stage as to what we're gonna hit on. I'll ask a couple questions and get things rolling. One thing, this group has no slides, no PowerPoints. It's all right here and coming at you through our mouths, but hopefully you'll be able to garner some good insight from us. So who do we have? We have Dave Gauci. Dave is the CEO of Goodville and also the PAMIC chairman. So I'm sure everyone here today knows who Dave is. We have Dan DeArmond. Dan is the CEO of Friends Cove, again, another industry veteran who has been involved with PAMIC for many years. And then we have a senior executive at Brightcore and Jeff Haney. And again, they're great insight from all three of them to really give their views. You know, what I really love about this panel is you have Dave from a mid to large size carrier, a lot of employees. So, you know, issues that may be facing his group on the return to work from a more of a larger scale. You have Dan from a small to medium size, and then you have Jeff, who has essentially been virtual his whole career. So, you know, not much change, but I'm sure there's been challenges. So again, I'll just set the stage for what we're going to talk about, and then I'll get us rolling. You know, my view, this pandemic it's touched everybody. It doesn't matter if you're a one-person operation or if you're a 50,000 person operation, multinational, single states, everyone, policyholders, carriers, of course, service providers. This disease has not discriminated, and you know, and it has forced companies to adapt. You know, some already had a remote workforce, but a lot did not, and they had to, on the fly, mobilize a workforce and you know, make sure there's policies and procedures and safety and different things in place. I mean, so many things. The last panel talking about workers' comp complications. You now have a remote workforce, and if I stand up and trip here next to my desk because I've got a cord, I mean, is that a comp claim? Is it not? There are so many different things that this pandemic has brought to light. But you know, and Zoom, I mean, we all have Zoom fatigue, and we've all had meetings with our cats walking in front of the screen, or my 17-year-old son blasting music in the background, whatever it is, or me blasting music while he's on virtual school. So it plays both ways. But yeah, I mean, we're all experiencing Zoom fatigue and adapting again to that. But again, there's a bit of a light at the end of the tunnel. People are starting to return to work. The states are lifting some requirements, and you know, there is some light. Things are happening. Restaurants are starting to open and so forth. So again, setting the stage, we're going to talk about those challenges and the opportunities that the return to work and the return to normalcy, whatever normalcy is going to be, whether it's everyone comes back and it's just like it was pre-pandemic, or it's a hybrid approach, whatever it is. So, you know, I'll start with you, Dave, if you don't mind, and then same question for all three of you. And essentially, it's, you know, your strategy. So again, things are starting to open up, and what are you planning on? What is your strategy? Are you planning a phased approach, to hybrid approach? You know, what are things going to look like in your office? And then same for you, Dave and Jeff, or Dan and Jeff.
All right. Well, it's good to be here with all of you today, and make it clear I don't have the answers. We're just struggling through all of this like everyone else. And if I've learned anything over the course of COVID, it's that long-term planning is a week or two sometimes, instead of typically you'd think months and quarters and years, but adapting to the changing environment has become a really critical skill in the last year. And the other thing I'll say is, we're throughout the course of COVID, we've really resisted making long-term decisions in the midst of a pandemic. So I think we're trying to take actions that we think make sense for the organization, but be really clear that these aren't permanent decisions. We're learning as we go, and we'll continue to adapt even after we're back at some point. We'll still be learning what the new reality looks like. But our approach right now is really, we're making the assumption that vaccine will become more available over the course of the next month or two. And it's really based on, here in Pennsylvania, we fall, insurance workers fall into the 1C category. And so we think somewhere mid to late April or early May, we'll have access to vaccine, which begins to give us a little more flexibility to think about what the next step is. So we are focusing on a phased in plan, beginning likely sometime in May, with that assumption of bringing some positions back to the office based on function and flexibility of those functions. So starting with we've had about 20% of our workforce that has continued to work in the office just because of required functions. So we're looking at phasing in over a period of weeks, an increased number of full-time workers, and then probably over another 4 to 6 weeks after that, bringing additional folks back on a hybrid basis. So maybe getting up to, by midsummer, getting up to maybe 60 or 70% of our typical population, and then riding with that through the end of the summer, and hopefully settling into whatever the new normal is in September.
So good afternoon, everyone. Happy to be here, and as Dave said, this is a pleasure to be able to kind of chat about these issues and to some extent just learn from one another and brainstorm a bit. But Friends Cove Mutual is a very small company. We have a total of 5 employees, and so maybe we relate a little more to a broader number of PAMIC members. There are a lot of smaller mutuals who are members. But one of the things that we were able to do really from the start is to promote. And I'm sure we'll get into some of those details a little bit later on. But for us, that's actually worked quite well. And so when I look to, do we come back to the office? Well, yeah, I think we do. But how? We're really thinking more about a hybrid approach, and based on employee comfort level and desire. I think it's important to have some time back in the office. So at some point, I'll say, we want to meet at least 1 or 2 days a week together, and kind of reignite that in-person company culture. But we've been able to do a pretty good job, in part because of our small size, about keeping that company culture. So, really for us, coming back into the office, or for me, coming back into the office comes down to what Dave said, and that's vaccine availability. When a worker is vaccinated, as far as I'm concerned, and fully vaccinated, they're welcome to come back into the office if they want. Will we compel that? No. And if someone doesn't want to be vaccinated, the last session discussed, it's not something that we would compel, but I honestly wouldn't allow someone to come back in until, if they didn't want to be vaccinated, until numbers of transmissions of cases was at or near zero, just to be able to protect any other folks in the office. But again, from our perspective, a very small company, we've been able to operate remotely without any real issues for a year now. And so we're pretty comfortable with that. And a hybrid approach is our thought going forward.
Yeah, and I would, well, first of all, thank you. It's great to be here, to be on this panel and to be with all of you today. There's two aspects to this for Brightcore. So we are a fully remote company. So in terms of our day-to-day operations, we're going to keep chugging on. That we operate remotely. We use Zoom. This is kind of par for the course for us. But the pandemic really impacted our ability to engage with our customers and to engage with industry events and to go to conferences and in our sales and marketing activities. So we are very much looking forward to being able to re-engage, but it's going to be hybrid. The pandemic forced us to think about what are those things that we need to do ahead of and after an interaction to make sure it's productive and effective. And what we've realized is that you can do a lot of what we need to do digitally. You can make it work, but it requires more prep. It requires more follow-up. And there are things that we need to keep doing, whether it's a digital event or whether it's an in-person event. And we're going to continue to focus on making that as effective as possible and using whatever venue is available to us with a preference, especially if it's connecting with others for in-person when we can.
Yeah, and a great point, Jeff. And similar for me, Inquiron is partial. They really were a hybrid approach pre-pandemic. You know, I'm in Michigan, the company's in Boston. We're all over the place. But you know, for me, from a sales perspective, similar to I'm sure you, Jeff, I'm able to close deals without ever meeting anyone in person, which makes me think, did I need to jump on the plane in the first place? You know, so I think there is, going forward, there is going to be some change in our thought process on, you know, meetings and conferences. We'll still attend them, but you know, maybe pick and choose and not as much just jumping on a plane to jump on a plane. Not that I did, but you know, I think we've proven that we can function without all of that travel and all of that, frankly, expense on planes and hotels and dinners and all those things. You know, we can close a deal like this. So, so anyway, yeah, that's my perspective. Kind of switching gears back to the in-office. So Dave, you've got people coming back in, you know, post-vaccine, of course. The office setup. I mean, we heard the panel before us talking about, you know, all the different things you need to factor in now. How do you space people out? You know, for a larger organization, I'm just curious what your thought process there, and then same for you, Dan, when Dave's done.
You know, I was thinking about, as Dan was talking, I was thinking about the uniqueness of different organizations and maybe the starting point or the scope of your organization really impacts how you need to respond to this. Because, you know, as an organization with almost 150 staff, you know, it's a unique circumstance to try to maintain corporate culture and sustain relationships across that organization. In relation to the building space, you know, we're in a bit of a unique situation in that area as well. We doubled the size of our building in 2017 and renovated our original building, which really spread our people out. We were really pretty much on top of each other when prior to that building project. So our employees actually have a lot more space than they did before, and we went to kind of new office layouts that I think are a little more socially distanced, even though that term wasn't in my vernacular before COVID arrived. A lot more conference rooms, a lot more meeting space. So I think we're in a situation where we can maintain a fairly high degree of safety, assuming vaccination rates are high enough and people follow appropriate protocols. So we've had really, as I said earlier, we've had about between 10 and 20% of our staff working in the building throughout the environment. So, you know, the building's been quiet enough that I'm in the office, the lights might go off in my area, and because I'm the only one working in it, so that's pretty socially distanced. But as so we've had mask requirements and extra cleaning going on, and just signs up everywhere, and kick plates on the doors to allow you to open doors without touching handle. I mean, all the things that we needed to do at the very beginning of the pandemic. And I think we will maintain all of those protocols until we get to a point where we feel like our vaccination rate is suitable to start to reduce them. And so that's really my leverage, I think, to encourage people to get vaccinated, is that maybe we can reduce some of those protocols in some cases when we get those vaccination rates to that point. Probably enough for now. So.
Yeah, so for our office setup, we actually did some renovations about 3 years ago, same time frame as Dave, but to a much smaller extent within our existing building, and kind of went from the open office format, cubicle kind of style, to actual fully enclosed offices. So while that wasn't, obviously we had no idea the pandemic was coming and social distancing might be an issue, it works out pretty well. We're really, when you're in your office, you're pretty much in your own space. It's just, for us, it won't be an issue. But I can imagine, if we still had our old setup, we might have to do some rearranging and space people out a bit more.
I'm not even sure if I should comment on this. As it happens, our lease came up for renewal in the middle of the pandemic. And so we did have an office. We have somewhere around 180, 190 people at Brightcore. And we had about a dozen people that were using it on a regular basis. And so we decided that we were going to really go fully remote and just eliminate that office. What we will be doing, though, and what we try to do, pandemic allowing, is have summits and employee meetings and get the organization together, whether that's occasionally all company, more frequently specific teams or groups that are getting together. So we are looking forward to using venues, typically hotels and conference centers, as that begins to open up, to safely and appropriately socially distanced, get our teams together and begin to meet periodically.
Yeah, that makes sense. All great points. And, and for us too, Caroline, who was on the session before, she's our head of HR and is in the Boston office where the majority of our employees are. I think there'll be some reconfiguration. We had some kind of a bullpen style in a certain area. We'll have to reconfigure a few things, whereas we did have individual office for others. So it's a really unique setup, though, our office. There's a lot of different rooms, so I think we'll be able to accommodate. But it's clearly things that you never really had to think about until now, for sure. Great points so far. So we're talking a little bit more about, and we've already hit on this, but just to really put a little more emphasis on it. Everyone's had to go remote, right? So everyone is now working from home, and some are used to it. Some are like, this isn't too bad. So, I'm just curious, again, I'll start with you, Dave, from a larger employer perspective. Some of your employees may prefer that remote workforce and prefer, the home environment. I'm just curious what if anything are your thoughts around an employee who would prefer to stay home? Is that going to be an option or no? And not holding you to it, obviously, but just your thoughts.
Yeah. Well, I'll start by going back to my my original statement about saying I'm not making long-term decisions in the midst of a pandemic.
Yep.
And I'll also say that pre-pandemic, I would say I was very much in the camp of remote workers will be the exception, the rare exception, not the rule, because our organization is, we're 96 years old. We're very relational oriented organization, both at every level, internally with employees, with agents, with members. And I guess I'm a little old school in thinking that the depth of relationships that we value are hard to sustain without any personal interaction. And again, I'm being proved wrong to some extent in that regard, and I'm adapting to that situation. But I think I think we are. I will just say I think early on in the pandemic, when we moved everybody home, it worked pretty smoothly. It was we were operating in what I would consider a crisis mode. All hands on deck to try to make sure we service well. And all in all, I would say we've served our members well and maintained, the blocking and tackling of the business. But as the year has gone on, I think the longer we're in this situation, I think the more stress is on the organization from a relational standpoint, from a project standpoint, the more strategic parts of the business, that I think it's easy to get off schedule when your priorities are shifted, as we are in a home work environment. And maybe that's just our lack of skill building around remote work. But it's a long way to say that my hope is to eventually get back to a more office-centric environment. I don't believe we'll ever be able to go back to the way it was before. I'm not that naive at this point, but I do think we'll end up with some positions in the organization that are office-based, based on function and equipment needs, and especially our frontline folks who work directly with call centers, members, where collaborating and being in the building, I think is really advantageous. Then there's another whole group of staff that we're planning to try this hybrid approach over the summer, where we'll allow some flexibility, some days in, some days out, and we'll see how it goes. And again, we'll evaluate and see how it goes, and we'll make decisions after we have more experience.
Yeah, that's fair. Dan, how about you? I know you already mentioned you may stick with the remote for some. What are your thoughts?
Yeah, I think that I've had employees, not that I have that many, but the ones that are near our office, live near our office, they've expressed a desire to either remain remote or at least be partially remote. And given the small nature of our company, and given some of the technology that we had in place before the pandemic that allowed us to transition very easily, it works. And so, at this point, I think we will likely be flexible. Like Dave, I agree that long-term planning is futile in this environment. It's amazing what a difference a couple of weeks can make, and how perspectives can change. And so in the long term, I don't know. I think eventually we'll probably come back into the office more than we would be remote. And some of that is based on what Dave said. Company culture, I think it can be maintained remotely. If you started that way to begin with, I think it's a whole lot easier. If you didn't start, so Brightcore, that's kind of how the culture was from the get-go. So it evolved that way. But for the rest of the insurance carriers, it didn't evolve that way. And so I think we can manage it on a temporary basis and do it pretty well. But in the long term, I think we lose something of not actually meeting together face to face, sitting down, maybe having a sandwich together over lunch or something along those lines. I think there's great value to those things. And so I don't want to dismiss it and say, yeah, we'll go fully remote forever. I also think the insurance department would have a problem if we went fully remote forever and didn't have an office building. But that's another discussion for another day.
Yeah, Brightcore is an interesting case. We prize in-person contact. And we have business drivers that have kind of led to this model that we've adopted. And so now I've got a team, with people in Boston and Reno, and I'm in North Carolina, and people in Missouri, and we just, this is the only option that works based on the geography we're reaching out to pool for our talent. But we really prize that in-person contact. And if I think about my career, actually, the best model that I saw personally was earlier when I was with Deloitte, and we had a hybrid model where we were in the office a couple of days and we worked from home a couple of days each week. And that was great. Focus time at home, crunch through things that you needed to, FaceTime with the team. That was the ideal. And if you can get, for me personally, and if you can move to a model like that, that's fantastic. If you're geographically dispersed, we can't do that, but anytime we can, we try to get our team members together.
Yeah, similar at Inquiron. A couple of things that I really miss. A lot of things I miss with the pandemic, but a couple of things because we're a remote company, and we would get together twice a year for sure. All employees, we do a summer retreat, and we would do some sort of holiday function. And obviously both were canceled. And that, it really, frankly, you have new employees. We have some new employees that I've never met, and won't get to meet until this is all done. And it really does kind of affect the culture. Like, it's one thing to get to know you, Jeff, through this virtual, but it's completely different when I get to meet you actually in person. So, I will be very excited when we can all come together and have those summer and winter retreats again. But right now, we can't have them. Actually, a couple of great questions have come in. So actually, one is specific for you, Jeff. How does a fully virtual company create a positive company culture and maintain it? And you've hit on a couple of these, but I'm just curious if you've got anything else. And then obviously for Dave and Dan, any of your thoughts on that question too?
Just a couple of things. We do have our company values, which are focused around transparency, honesty, communication, and productivity. And I think our leadership team and really all of us try to model that and be as transparent and open and give all of our team members access to the information that they need to be effective. And then on a very simple level, we try to meet frequently, not to spend all of our times in meetings, but for example, my team has a short daily meeting every day. So we've got that touch point. We've got our Zoom cameras on. We can see each other, can have a little bit of chit chat, make sure we're all doing okay, make sure we all know what we're working on. And you'll see that reflected throughout our organization, whether it's daily meetings for teams or weekly meetings between managers and subordinates, just those frequent touch points so that you don't get disconnected. And you can model those behaviors, have that frequent contact. And then in addition to those frequent work meetings, we will periodically have book clubs or other meetings where we're focused on something that's a little more oriented toward just the personal side of what we're doing, so we can maintain that connection and get to know all of us for who we are, not just the role we play at Brightcore.
That's great. So Dave, how about you during the pandemic? What have you guys been doing to help with culture and collaboration and touch points and so forth?
Yeah, so we're adapting from the other side where, having lunch together and being socializing together is a very normal thing. Now it's how do you replace that? And so, what we have done is just added a lot of new formalized communication channels that would not have been in place before. Some of which will probably sustain. So for example, I'm doing a town hall meeting every month instead of quarterly at this point. It's not the same. I'm talking to a video screen like I am right now, and I can't see the 150 people out there, but I know they're there. And so it's a lot less satisfying, to be honest, but I know how important it is that they hear from me and other leaders in the organization on a regular basis. We're doing department meetings every 2 weeks. We're doing team meetings every week, and trying to encourage, Zoom interactions rather than phone calls, just so you have some face connection. But again, all those things are attempts to replace what we had, and I think they're somewhat effective. But I think I think there's a one dimension, there's a less multi-dimensional relationship, I think, when it's through a screen. And so I have to say, I haven't found enough creative ways to connect to individual employees. So there's a lot of people I haven't seen in a long time. So it's uncomfortable. Not that I like to have control of everything, but I sure don't feel like I have much control at this point. So.
Yeah, no, great point. How about you, Dan?
Yeah, I mean, some of the same approaches. With only a few employees early on, we did very, very regular team meetings. And when I say team, I mean everybody in the company for my in my situation. And some of that was just informational. The department of the insurance department was coming out with regular updates and new information. And so, I would be on those calls, and then we would have a follow-up meeting with the staff to say, hey, here's what's going on. Here's what's, department asking us to relax this and do that. And then of course we would, talk about things, needs, how things are going. But honestly, over time, that kind of evolved into more ad hoc meetings. And one of the things, interestingly enough, that seems to have developed is we use a unified communication system, Ring Central, hosted. And I know Brightcore uses the same one, but it has a messaging platform built into it, much like Slack, but not exactly the same. And we use that as just to kind of chat back and forth at different times of the day. Simple things like, hey, I'm stepping away from my desk for lunch, so that people know I'm not going to be around for the next 45 minutes or so. And somebody will, talk about what they're doing this weekend. And so the water cooler kind of chat that might have happened, just passing in the hallway or stopping by somebody's office, it doesn't happen to the same extent, but it still happens. And so that's kind of nice to see, and helps to maintain that culture a little bit more.
Yeah, that's great. And similarly, we don't do Ring Central, but we use the Slack platform, and we have so many kind of subgroups within Slack. We have, I think one is called like positivity, and different employees will share photos of where they're at, the snowstorm that's coming through Denver yesterday or the day before. People are putting in pictures of their kids in 2 feet of snow and things like that. Yeah, so I think that personal touch, how is Doug doing in Michigan? How is Tara doing in Denver? How is Caroline doing in Boston? Just, bringing them all together. So there is a platform for some camaraderie and non-work touch points. Yeah, and those are things we did pre-COVID, but we really emphasize it now because, there was some togetherness once in a while pre-COVID, and now, at least until we're all vaccinated, it's going to be a while. And to that, so we have another interesting question, and I'm curious. I know the answer for inquire on, but someone asked a question: have any of you? Oh no, I'm sorry, wrong one. Have any of you given a financial incentive for your employees to get the vaccination? Inquire on offered me $150,000 to get the. No. We've had no incentive, but I'm just curious. Has anyone heard of that?
I've heard of it. I've heard of companies doing it. We have not gone there yet. I mean, partially because it's not been available to most employees, and we don't know if an incentive is going to be required. I do expect that I'm confident I won't get 100% adoption of vaccine, and so I think we'll have to figure out what level it's going to need to be to get comfortable. And but we haven't paid people to do it. So
yeah,
same here. We haven't done that, and it's not my intention to do that.
Yeah, same here. It's because we're dispersed, just not even really on our radar yet. Is something that we'll need to be concerned with.
Yeah, and the only thing through our healthcare provider, all employees get emails, and so encouraging
vaccination, here's where your state is, and here's some information on your state and how to get it and so forth. But yeah, but no incentives to date. So, and actually I had my first one. So a couple weeks away from having my second. I'm not looking forward to that one because lots of people have said the second one is, but I'll get through it. It'll be good. So I know there's a couple other questions flowing in, but I know we're getting close to the end. And one question that I know Ron wanted us to address, and while I've got a couple of CEOs from mutual carriers on, and it's on the regulatory and legislative issues. You know, when we talked about our prep call, is there anything that you guys wanted PAMIC to address, you know, that have come forth during this pandemic? Dan, I think you mentioned paper filings, and it's time for that to end. And so, you know, I'm just curious, are there any legislative or regulatory issues that that are on the forefront of your mind, or that have come out of this pandemic?
Yeah, I mean, you know, you've mentioned it, but you know, the paper filings requirement, and I confess I haven't done research into the issue to know whether it's a statutory requirement, whether it's a regulatory requirement, what it would take to actually change it. But you know, we're filing paper copies, and the department has asked us, and we certainly are happy to then file electronic copies as well. You know, in most cases, when we're talking about financial statements, we're filing them with the NAIC. We're then mailing a hard copy notarized to the insurance department. And then we're also sending a scanned copy or just a PDF with electronic signatures to our analyst and to their supervisor at the insurance department. And so, you know, we're sending the same information 3 times. It's not that we necessarily mind doing it, but it seems like you know, as COVID has pushed an awful lot of things forward, that maybe we could consider just doing electronic filings and kind of getting rid of that hard copy paper. Just a bit of a nuisance item more than anything else.
To my panelists, this is Ron. Because of Dan's eloquence and foresight, at a meeting with the insurance department last week on an unrelated topic, we had some time at the end, and I actually did bring this issue of what lessons learned can we bring to the department about reforms that make sense. And I used the example, Dan, of, I didn't use your name, obviously, of, you know, filings. Why do we have to file in multiple places? Why do we still have to get wet signatures? Why is a jurat page still even required anymore? All those kinds of things that are part of an older scheme of regulation. And if you really think about it, the laws that regulate insurance, the more modern laws, yeah, they've been tweaked over the years, but they date back some from the 20s and most of them from the 70s. So it's time to really take a hard look at it, because it'll make us more effective and efficient, and make them more effective and efficient as a department. And since we pay their bill, you know, that's a pretty important incentive for us. Here's the good news. They were very receptive to wanting to hear from the industry on what reforms we should consider. So we'll have to work on that, obviously, over the course of the next year or so, but at least we have a positive response out of the department on it.
Oh, that's great
to hear.
Very good. So Dave, did you have any other things that came to mind?
No, I don't know that I would. I mean, we're, of course, the you know, business interruption litigation issues and the presumption of coverage and work comp, all those kind of things are issues for us. We're thinking about that are new elements based on COVID, but those have been well discussed. So I won't go deep into that one. So
good. Well, we have one other business office building question that came in. I'll hit on, and then I'll wrap this up. But actually, let me pull it up again. It was about, have any of you installed air filters and purifiers capable of killing COVID and possibly any emerging viruses in your offices?
I can jump in there. We, I think your options, as I understand it, your options for what to do with airflow and purification really depend on the type of heating and cooling system you have. I mean, there's limitations in what you can do. So here in our office in New Holland, we've added additional airflow so we can increase the level of outside air that comes in with airflow. And so we've increased outside airflow to try to get more flushing of inside air to the outside. With our regional office in Ohio, we added a ultraviolet light system in our cooling and heating system that supposedly adds some level of purification, virus killing purification, but whether that's material or not, but I don't know, but I do think employees appreciate the effort. So
sure.
Yeah, and we have not done anything like that. I mean, for a variety of reasons, but the biggest one is that we've been fully remote, so we really haven't had folks in the office over this past year.
Yeah. Well, I think after that question, I'm going to ask Caroline, our head of HR, if she'll pay for a new filter and a ultraviolet light for my house. See, there she is.
Still here.
So Caroline, have we done anything in Boston?
No, we've been working remotely pretty effectively. And like I talked about, that cost benefit analysis, it was really not really there quite yet, especially because we are on public transit. And we did a survey this summer and it was unanimous that people were not comfortable going back. People are doing a good job at home. So I think just waiting until people are vaccinated and it's something that we don't have to worry about.
Sounds good. Thank you. Thanks for jumping in.
No problem.
All right. So last question or final thoughts. As we're starting to see that light, employees are starting to come back a little bit. We're figuring out what the future holds, but final thoughts, anything that comes to mind, and anything good, either personally or professionally, that you feel has come out of COVID. And I think we always focus on the negative, obviously, but if any thoughts on something good that has come out of it. So Dave, I'll start with you.
Well, it's hard for me to come up with a lot of good about COVID, to be candid, but I think a couple of positives. I think anything in life and our experience that causes us to rethink assumptions that we've had and challenges our thinking to revisit how we do things and what the priorities are and how we best go about accomplishing those priorities. I think there's opportunities there. One really tangible thing that I think has been good for us here at Goodville is, we have a regional office in Ohio where I have about 25 people that joined us through an affiliation, and with the vast majority of employees being in our Pennsylvania office, all of them had to, for the last 5 or 6 years since they joined us, relate to us through video. And so I think one of the realizations for all of our Pennsylvania staff now is they now better understand what it's like for those employees who are in a satellite office or happen to be working remotely, because we have a handful of those. How to accommodate, how to integrate people into that, because if you've been on the other side of that, you do understand a little bit better what it feels like to experience being not in the home office at this point. So that's a positive.
Sure. Thanks.
Yeah, and for from my perspective, I think one of the positives that I've heard from my own staff is just the ability to spend more time at home with family that may not have been there before. One of my team has 3 school age kids, anywhere from kind of later elementary up through high school. And she said that this has been just a fantastic experience that she's never had. She's worked, her entire life really at our office, and only gotten to spend time with her kids in the evenings and weekends, and she's really appreciated this. That can be a double-edged sword, but for a temporary period of time, I think that's been a blessing, and I would kind of echo that sentiment as well from my employee. It's been nice to I have a 100-mile commute each way when I go to the office, and to not spend 3+ hours on the road, several days a week, which is what I was doing for 15 years, about 3 days a week. I have to say it's going to be hard going back to that. And so time with family is the positive.
Good.
Great.
Yeah, definitely time with family. I would echo that. As a digital company, we still relied on a lot of in-person events and other things in terms of how we connect to our customers. I think this applies to carriers as well. And COVID forced us to think through and to get creative. How can we connect with them in other ways? How can we use these digital channels? And as we hopefully get back to something that is more like normal, we want to make sure we continue to use those new skills, those new capabilities that we've developed, and make sure we're taking sort of a full spectrum approach to engaging with our clients and engaging with our engaging with the industry, so that we're maximizing those opportunity to have the opportunity to have that relationship and to make sure that we stay close to our customers.
Doug, this is Ron, and before you close, I just want to bring to the attention of our audience that our relationship with Inquirin is a very strong one. Not only are you a member of PAMIC, but you provide that service, that HR Law and Cyber Center service that is available to every member of PAMIC. For every insurer, it is part of your membership. For any other of our associate members, there's a nominal charge if you would want to consider doing that. But within that are all the issues we talked about related to HR and policies, and those things can be developed through that. You get to ask lawyers real questions, real lawyers real questions on HR related issues and cyber issues. And if you're not familiar with it, give us a call at PAMIC and we'll introduce you to it and the right people, so that you can as you go through your efforts to normalize your new workforce, you're going to have to look at new policies and employee handbooks and those kinds of things. So I just urge you to get involved with that kind of thing. So with that said, I want to thank you as well. The other thing, this is shameless self-promotion now. We believe at PAMIC that we'll be able to start going fully in person with our convention, which is in Hershey this year, and that's in August. But we do have our 2-day virtual claims summit coming up in May. So take a look at that, and it will be offered in a similar pattern. It's not the best, but last year we had to cancel it outright. This year we get a chance to at least offer, some of the things that we have traditionally offered. So anyway, I want to say thank you to the panelists as well. And Doug, I'm going to turn it over to you, and I'm going to mute myself, and you can send us all on our way home.
All right. So since I said, what is one personal or professional positive of COVID, I'll stick with my one personal. I'm not handy. I'm very not handy at all. Light bulbs are a challenge, but my wife and I actually replaced our kitchen chandelier during the pandemic, and it's still standing, goes on and off. So we watched a lot of YouTube videos and got a ladder. And so I'm not saying that I'll do it for you, but I actually have a working chandelier that I never would have attempted, but for being home so much and needing a project. So with that, again, thank you. I really appreciated this opportunity. And Tim, I'll throw it to you to close us out.
Yeah, thanks, Doug. And thanks for all the panelists, David, Dan, and Jeff, for participating on a very interesting topic. And I think a lot of people were taking notes on this one. Doug, back to that chandelier, I have a question. I hope you paid your homeowner's insurance. Not that I doubt your work, However, if a guest comes for dinner and it falls on them, not that that would happen, we want to make sure the guest is covered, but just checking on that.
Good point, Tim. Thank
great
you.
story on that. So anyway, just thanking everyone that was participating on the panel, and we appreciate it. Had a few closing notes for all the attendees. Again, thanks for everyone who registered and participated for or listened for the 2 days, because our participation rate was very high all the way to the end. So thanks for this panel for keeping everyone awake. It was great. And we'll be sending out, PAMIC will be sending out an email with a survey link where we want everyone's feedback. And the way these programs stay high quality is to get honest feedback. And also there's usually an area where you can put suggestions of topics you'd like to see next time, or speakers that you'd like to volunteer. And I wanted to thank all the sponsors that we saw in between the breaks on the slides and the video advertisements, and of course to the committee that put a lot of the speakers in place. There will be CPE certificates sent out to all attendees via email, and CE credits will be assigned tomorrow. A reminder that these presentations and a rewatchable link will be visible to all who attended on the PAMIC website. So to get everyone off to the end of the day, we just wish you well, and thanks for everyone's participation. And again, hope to see everyone soon. While the virtual is fun, we all know we want to see each other over a drink or cocktail. So anyway, have a good evening, and thanks again.